He owns 63% of the restaurant.
You were there when it began.
I was told it was legal.
Brian Thompson was 39, a quiet restaurant operations consultant who spent more nights inspecting dining rooms than sitting in one. Most people in Chicago believed he was simply a dependable middle manager who worked too hard for too little. Even his wife, Layla, had begun treating his modest life as proof that he would never become more. He drove an aging SUV packed leftovers for lunch and wore the same inexpensive watch every day. What they didn't know was that Brian quietly owned the very restaurant where Chicago's elite celebrated their biggest victories. Then, through a security monitor, he watched Layla walk into one of its private dining rooms beside another man, and his fingers slowly tightened around the polished walnut desk. If you're watching from somewhere in the world today, leave a comment telling me your country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy slow burn stories where patience beats pride and the truth always catches up, consider subscribing so you won't miss tomorrow's story. Brian Thompson parked his aging dark blue Toyota Highlander in the employee garage beneath Hawthorne House at exactly 6:18 p.m. Every Thursday he inspected the restaurant without announcing himself. It had been his routine for nearly 7 years. The staff recognized him immediately, but most guests assumed he was another operations manager making sure the dining room stayed polished before the evening rush. That misunderstanding had never bothered him. If anything, Brian preferred it. The elevator opened directly into the administrative hallway. Warm light spilled across polished walnut floors, while the distant sounds of crystal glasses and quiet jazz drifted through hidden speakers. Hawthorne House had occupied the corner of North Wabash Avenue for almost a century. Politicians celebrated election victories there. Professional athletes signed endorsement deals there. Fortune 500 executives reserved the private dining rooms months in advance. Very few of those guests knew who actually owned the building. Brian intended to keep it that way. Emily Carter, the restaurant's general manager, looked up from the reception office the moment he entered. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson." Her voice remained professional as always. Brian smiled. "How's the dining room?" Emily handed him a tablet displaying the evening schedule. "We're fully booked. 192 covers tonight. 6 private rooms are occupied. No staffing issues. Marcus says tonight's dry-aged ribeye shipment is probably the best he's seen this year." Brian nodded. "Any customer complaints?" "None." "Kitchen delays. Average ticket time is 18 minutes. He gave a quiet nod of approval. "Excellent." Emily hesitated. Reservation 4817 requested the river room about an hour ago. Brian glanced down at the screen. "Corporate dinner?" "So it appears." He handed the tablet back without another question. "Let's keep everything running exactly as usual." "As always." That was another thing Brian insisted upon. Nothing changed because he arrived. Servers never rushed. Managers never hovered. Guests never received special treatment because the owner happened to be inside the building. The restaurant earned its reputation one consistent evening at a time. Brian walked slowly through the kitchen. Marcus Reed stood over a charcoal grill finishing 2 prime steaks. He looked up briefly. "Evening, Mr. Thompson." Brian inspected the line. Every station moved with quiet precision. No shouting, no chaos, only disciplined rhythm. "Looks good, Marcus. We're ready for whatever tonight throws at us." Brian smiled. "I know." He continued into the wine cellar before climbing the narrow staircase leading toward the operations office. Unlike the elegant dining rooms below, the office was simple. Several security monitors, reservation software, inventory reports, accounting terminals. Nothing glamorous. Exactly the way Brian liked it. He poured himself black coffee before sitting beside the monitor wall. He rarely watched guests. Privacy mattered. The cameras primarily existed for employee safety security incidents and operational reviews. Most nights he spent more time studying reservation patterns than watching dining rooms. Emily stepped quietly into the office. "Private room 3 is checked in." Brian barely looked away from his coffee. "Reservation 4817? "Yes." He clicked the reservation. 2 guests, corporate account, Mercer Logistics Group. Host, Daniel Mercer. Brian recognized the company immediately, one of Chicago's fastest-growing transportation firms. Its CEO appeared regularly in business magazines. Brian had never met him. The camera switched automatically as the host escorted the guests toward the private hallway. Brian's hand stopped halfway to his coffee. The woman entering behind the host looked painfully familiar. Chestnut hair, camel-colored designer coat, small diamond earrings, the leather handbag Brian had purchased for her birthday 2 years earlier. Layla. For one brief second, everything became unnaturally still. Not because he doubted what he saw, because his mind refused to connect the image with reality. Layla was supposed to be attending a regional marketing dinner with coworkers. She had mentioned it over breakfast while scrolling through emails. Brian remembered every word. "It'll probably run late." He had simply answered, "Drive safely." Now she was walking through the private entrance of his own restaurant, not alone. Daniel Mercer walked beside her. Tall, expensively dressed, confident. He rested one hand lightly against Layla's back as the host opened the river room. It was a small gesture, natural, comfortable, far too familiar. Brian neither frowned nor spoke. He simply watched the door close behind them. Emily remained standing quietly beside him. She had noticed the change in his expression. "Mr. Thompson." Brian took one slow breath. "What server has the river room?" "Olivia." "Good." Another pause. "Tell Olivia nothing unusual." Emily waited. No interruptions. "Understood. Normal service." "Of course." Brian looked back toward the monitor. "Also, preserve every operational record associated with Reservation 4817. Emily blinked once. "The receipt. Everything." "The reservation, yes. Service logs. Yes. Kitchen timestamps. Yes." She understood immediately. "Done." "No one discusses this with anyone?" "Absolutely not." Brian appreciated Emily for many reasons. She never asked unnecessary questions. She simply carried out professional procedures. Minutes later, Olivia Brooks appeared on another monitor carrying menus into the river room. Brian watched only long enough to confirm ordinary service. Then he deliberately turned his chair away from the screen. He had already seen enough. Anger tempted impulsive people to seek immediate answers. Brian had spent most of his career learning that important decisions became dangerous when made during emotional moments. He opened the evening operations report instead. Wine inventory, payroll adjustments, weekend reservations. His eyes moved across the pages. His thoughts remained elsewhere. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Emily returned. "Everything has been preserved." Brian nodded. "Thank you." She remained standing. "If you'd prefer, I could have another manager oversee tonight." Brian looked at her calmly. "No. You don't have to stay." "I do." She waited. "This restaurant has 112 employees depending on tonight going smoothly." His voice stayed remarkably even. "My personal life doesn't change that." Emily gave a respectful nod. "I understand." She quietly left. Brian stared at the closed office door. The silence felt heavier now. Not because he wanted to storm downstairs. Not because he imagined dramatic confrontations. Because disappointment often arrived without noise. It simply settled into the room and refused to leave. Almost 20 minutes passed. The security system notified him that appetizers had been served. Another notification appeared. Premium reserve wine requested. The bottle cost nearly $600. Daniel Mercer had approved it without hesitation. Brian recognized the selection. Layla had once admired that exact vintage while reading a wine magazine. She had joked that only executives ever drank bottles like that. Apparently tonight someone had ordered one for her. Brian closed the reservation software. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the office window overlooking the Chicago River. Outside boats drifted slowly beneath the evening lights. Traffic rolled steadily across Michigan Avenue. The city continued exactly as before. Inside Hawthorne House, dinner service continued with equal precision. Only one thing had changed. Brian now understood that the marriage he believed he still had might have ended long before this evening. And somewhere behind the closed doors of the River Room, a conversation was unfolding that would soon reveal far more than either guest intended. It overlooked the Chicago River through floor-to-ceiling windows, yet remained completely secluded from the main dining room. Walnut paneling softened every sound. A crystal chandelier reflected warm light across polished silverware. The room seated only 6 guests, making it the preferred choice for confidential business negotiations, engagement dinners, and conversations that people believed no one else would ever know about. Brian had designed it that way. Privacy created trust. Trust created loyal customers. Now that same privacy protected the people who were quietly destroying his marriage. Brian stood outside the operations office window for another minute before returning to his desk. He forced himself to focus on paperwork instead of the monitor displaying the River Room. He had no intention of spying. There was a difference between preserving restaurant records and invading personal conversations. He intended to stay firmly on the lawful side of that line. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Olivia Brooks stepped into the office carrying her service tablet. She had worked at Hawthorne House for nearly 9 years. Calm under pressure, observant without being intrusive, she had become one of Brian's most trusted managers. "You asked me to update you if anything operational came up." Brian looked up. "Anything unusual?" Olivia chose her words carefully. "Nothing involving service quality." She paused. "But the guests appear very familiar with one another." Brian remained silent. Olivia continued. "They declined wine recommendations because Mr. Mercer already knew exactly what Miss Thompson preferred." Brian lowered his eyes briefly. "The 2015 Napa Reserve." Olivia nodded. "Yes." That single detail landed harder than Brian expected. Years earlier, Layla had once pointed at that bottle while they celebrated their anniversary. She had laughed when she saw the price. Maybe one day. Brian had smiled and answered, maybe. He had quietly purchased the bottle anyway, not to impress her, to surprise her after he completed the restaurant acquisition. The bottle had remained in his private cellar ever since. Tonight another man had ordered it without hesitation. Olivia continued. "They didn't ask to see the wine list." "I understand." "They also requested that no one interrupt the meal." Brian simply nodded. "Thank you." Olivia hesitated again. "There was one more thing." Brian waited. "When Miss Thompson sat down." She stopped for a moment, almost reconsidering whether to continue. "She removed her wedding ring before I poured the wine." Silence filled the office. Brian neither blinked nor reacted outwardly. His right hand simply rested a little more firmly against the desk. "When, exactly?" "Immediately after taking her seat." "Did she hide it?" Olivia answered carefully. "She placed it inside her handbag, not on the table, not beside her plate, inside the handbag, as though she had done it before." Brian thanked Olivia. "You've done exactly what I asked. I wasn't sure whether I should mention it." "You should." She nodded once before quietly leaving. The office felt strangely colder after the door closed. Brian reached for his coffee. It had gone cold. He set it aside, untouched. The security system displayed routine updates. Entrees fired, wine delivered, desserts scheduled. Every timestamp automatically recorded, every server interaction documented. Nothing unusual. Exactly as a professional restaurant should operate. Brian finally allowed himself one brief glance toward the monitor. No audio. Only silent video. Daniel Mercer leaned comfortably across the table while speaking. Layla smiled. Not politely, not professionally. Comfortably. She laughed. Brian recognized that laugh. It was softer than the one she used around friends. Years ago she laughed that way while they painted their first apartment together. He turned away almost immediately. He did not need more confirmation. He already knew enough. Emily entered carrying several printed receipts. Kitchen copies. Brian accepted them. Every private dining reservation automatically generated duplicate service records. Reservation number, arrival time, table assignments, wine orders, payment method. Nothing extraordinary. Emily placed another folder beside them. The host log. Brian opened it. Reservation number 4817. Guest name Daniel Mercer. Company Mercer Logistics Group. Guests 2. Requested privacy level maximum. Special notes. No interruptions unless requested. Brian read the page once before closing it. Everything was ordinary. Everything was legitimate. Everything belonged in restaurant records regardless of who occupied the room. That mattered. If legal questions ever arose, the documentation would already exist as part of normal business operations rather than being created after the fact. Brian believed in preparation. Preparation removed doubt. Another notification appeared. Dessert service requested. Olivia entered the river room again. The monitor briefly showed Daniel standing to pull Layla's chair slightly closer before sitting back down. It lasted only seconds. Professional cameras recorded movement, not emotions. Still, small gestures often spoke louder than dramatic scenes. Emily quietly broke the silence. "I'm sorry." Brian looked at her. "For what?" "No one deserves this." He considered the words, then answered calmly. "People make choices." Emily didn't know how to respond. Brian wasn't defending anyone, nor was he condemning them. He simply refused to let emotion replace observation. A few minutes later, Olivia returned one final time. This time, her expression was noticeably different. "They're finishing dessert." Brian nodded. "Anything operational?" There was a conversation. Brian looked at her. "I couldn't hear everything." He appreciated that answer. She wasn't pretending certainty. "I was clearing plates." And Olivia searched her memory. Mr. Mercer smiled and said something close to... She frowned slightly. "Everything will finally be ours after next week." Brian remained completely still. Olivia continued. Miss Thompson laughed. Did she respond? I only heard the last few words. What were they? "He'll never see it coming." Neither sentence proved anything by itself. Neither identified what it meant. Neither justified assumptions. But together, they changed the shape of the evening. Brian wrote the words exactly as Olivia remembered them. Not conclusions, not interpretations. Simple observations with approximate quotations. That distinction mattered. Facts first, meaning later. Olivia looked almost uncomfortable. "I wish I hadn't heard any of it." Brian closed the notebook. "So do I." She quietly excused herself. Brian remained alone again. Outside the office window, twilight had disappeared. Chicago glowed beneath thousands of lights reflecting across the river. Inside Hawthorne House, another successful dinner service continued with practiced elegance. Servers smiled, wine flowed, anniversary couples toasted each other, business contracts changed hands. Life moved forward at every table except one. Brian opened the restaurant's digital archive. Every evening, surveillance footage was automatically retained for 30 days before being overwritten unless preserved for operational reasons. He selected reservation 4,817. Retention status, pending deletion in 30 days. He clicked one button. Archive permanently. The system requested a reason. Brian typed only 4 words. Operational documentation requested. Nothing more. No personal comments. No accusations. The archive confirmation appeared. File preserved. He closed the program. Several minutes later, the host notified the office that reservation 4,817 had requested the check. Daniel Mercer paid using a Mercer Logistics corporate credit card. The receipt printed automatically. Brian looked at the timestamp. 8:47 p.m. Exactly 29 minutes later, another notification appeared. Guests exited through the private entrance. Brian watched only long enough to see Layla remove something from her handbag. Her wedding ring. She slid it back onto her finger before stepping onto the sidewalk beside Daniel. Neither of them looked toward the office windows above. Neither of them knew the quiet man upstairs had watched only enough to understand the truth. And neither of them had the slightest idea that every reservation record, every service log, every archived security file, and even the receipt folded into Daniel Mercer's jacket pocket now belonged to the husband they believed was nothing more than an ordinary employee. Brian Thompson left Hawthorne House a little after 10 that evening. He did not rush. He thanked the closing managers. He shook Marcus Reed's hand after complimenting the kitchen on another flawless service. He reminded Emily Carter to email him the weekend reservation forecast before noon the following day. Nothing in his behavior suggested that anything unusual had happened. Only after the elevator doors closed behind him did he finally allow himself to exhale. The parking garage was nearly empty. He unlocked his old Highlander and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. Silence settled around him. For the first time all evening, there were no employees to reassure, no customers to protect, no restaurant to supervise, only a husband sitting alone inside an aging SUV. His eyes drifted toward the windshield. Rain had begun falling over downtown Chicago. Small drops collected beneath the parking lights before slowly sliding downward. Brian remained motionless. He replayed the evening exactly as it had happened, not emotionally, chronologically. Layla entering the restaurant, Daniel Mercer placing a hand against her back, the wedding ring disappearing into her handbag, the expensive wine, the words Olivia remembered hearing. He'll never see it coming. Brian had spent years solving operational problems, a broken refrigeration system, unexpected health inspections, payroll emergencies, kitchen fires, vendor failures. Experience had taught him one lesson above all others. Facts came first. Reactions came later. He started the engine. The drive home usually took 25 minutes. Tonight it felt much longer. Chicago's streets shimmered beneath the rain. Traffic moved steadily along Lakeshore Drive, while jazz played softly through the speakers. Brian barely noticed either. Instead, memories surfaced one after another. Not because he wanted them to. Because disappointment always searched for happier days. He remembered meeting Layla 13 years earlier at a neighborhood charity fundraiser. She had been working as a junior marketing coordinator. He had just accepted a demanding position helping struggling restaurants improve operations. Neither had much money. Neither cared. They spent Saturday mornings exploring street markets instead of shopping malls. They celebrated anniversaries with homemade dinners. When Brian proposed, the engagement ring had been modest. Layla cried anyway. At least she had then. 3 years after their wedding, Brian received an unusual phone call. A longtime hospitality investor named Harold Whitmore wanted help restructuring Hawthorne House. The restaurant stood on the edge of bankruptcy. Costs had exploded. Management turnover frightened investors. Historic reputation alone could no longer keep the doors open. Brian agreed to consult for 6 months. The project changed his life. Instead of simply reducing expenses, he redesigned nearly every operational system: vendor contracts, kitchen workflow, private dining strategy, reservation software, wine inventory, employee retention. Within 18 months, Hawthorne House returned to profitability. Several original investors decided to sell. Brian quietly invested every dollar he had saved. He sold inherited land in Wisconsin, liquidated retirement accounts, accepted almost no personal spending for 3 years. Harold noticed. One evening, he asked a simple question. Would you rather collect consulting fees or own part of the future? Brian chose ownership. Slowly, patiently, year after year. Whenever another shareholder exited, Brian purchased additional equity. No newspapers covered the transactions. No celebration followed. Eventually, he became majority owner. Only the board attorneys, accountants, and senior management knew. Even then, Brian insisted his name remain invisible. Harold once asked why. Brian answered honestly, "I'd rather know who respects me before they know what I own." Harold laughed. "You'll learn uncomfortable truths." Brian had smiled. "I'm prepared for that." Tonight, those words echoed differently. The garage door opened as Brian pulled into the driveway of the 2-story brick home he shared with Layla in Lincoln Park. The porch light remained off. Her car wasn't there yet. He entered quietly. The house felt strangely unfamiliar. He placed his keys inside the same ceramic bowl Layla had bought during a vacation in Vermont. He loosened his tie, hung his jacket, fed their golden retriever Cooper, who greeted him with the same excitement as every evening. Dogs never cared about titles, or wealth, or appearances. Cooper simply leaned against Brian's leg while eating dinner. Brian scratched behind his ears before walking into the kitchen. The refrigerator held prepared meals Layla had cooked on Sunday. She still performed familiar routines. Life had continued outwardly. Only trust had quietly disappeared. At 11:14 p.m., headlights illuminated the driveway. Brian looked through the living room window. Layla stepped out carrying her handbag. She checked her reflection in the side mirror before walking toward the front door. By the time she entered, Brian was reading a hospitality magazine on the sofa. He looked up. "You're home." She smiled naturally. "Sorry I'm late." "Long dinner." She slipped off her shoes. "You know how quarterly planning meetings are." Brian watched her calmly. "They kept ordering food." He nodded once. "Did everything go well?" "I think so." She hung her coat inside the hallway closet. "My boss thinks we're finally ready for the national campaign." Brian noticed something almost immediately. The wedding ring remained on her finger. She had remembered to put it back on. "I hope it works out." She smiled. "Me too." She walked into the kitchen. "I'm exhausted." Brian heard running water, cabinet doors opening, the familiar sounds of someone pretending nothing had changed. She returned carrying a glass of water. "What about you?" "Busy night." "Any problems?" "None." She seemed relieved. Neither mentioned Hawthorne House. Neither mentioned Daniel Mercer. Neither mentioned the river room. Brian realized something important. Lies often survived because honest people volunteered information, while dishonest people waited to see what questions were asked. He asked none. Layla eventually kissed him lightly on the cheek. "I'm going upstairs." "Good night." She disappeared toward the bedroom. Brian remained downstairs another hour. Not because he couldn't sleep, because he needed to think without interruption. Around 1 in the morning, he walked quietly into his home office. Unlike the elegant office at Hawthorne House, this room contained only practical furniture: a wooden desk, accounting files, personal records, several framed photographs. One picture showed Brian and Layla standing outside Hawthorne House on reopening night after the renovation. She believed they had simply been invited guests. She never knew Brian had delivered the reopening speech before the doors opened that evening. He opened his laptop, not to investigate Layla. Instead, he searched for one name: Victoria Bennett. Although he already knew her number by memory, Victoria had represented Hawthorne House through multiple commercial acquisitions. She also specialized in high-asset family law. Brian had recommended her to friends before. Now he needed her himself. He opened a blank email. Subject: private consultation request. The message contained only 3 sentences. Victoria: I need to schedule a confidential meeting as early as possible tomorrow. This concerns a personal legal matter requiring discretion. Thank you, Brian Thompson. He pressed send. The email left his outbox at 1:18 a.m. Brian closed the laptop. No accusations had been made. No confrontation had occurred. No revenge had begun. Only preparation. The following morning at exactly 7:42 a.m., while Brian stood alone in the kitchen pouring coffee, his phone vibrated. Victoria Bennett. He answered immediately. Good morning. Her voice sounded calm and direct. I received your email. Thank you for calling. I cleared my afternoon. Brian remained silent, then said quietly, I believe my marriage may already be over. Victoria didn't rush to respond. Instead, she asked the question Brian expected from an experienced attorney. Do you want justice, or do you want revenge? Brian looked through the kitchen window toward the quiet street outside. When he answered, his voice never changed. I want the truth. Another brief silence followed. Then Victoria spoke with the certainty of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms. Good. She paused. Because the truth takes preparation. Starting now, you do nothing emotional. We build this correctly. Brian ended the call with one clear realization. The hardest part of the night had not been discovering Layla in another man's company. The hardest part would be remaining patient long enough to let the truth reveal everything else. Brian arrived at Victoria Bennett's office at precisely 2:00 p.m. The law firm occupied the 23rd floor of a limestone building overlooking Daly Plaza. Unlike many downtown firms that displayed expensive artwork and oversized reception areas, Bennett & Cole projected quiet confidence. The furniture was understated. The walls were lined with legal texts instead of decorative awards. Even the receptionist spoke in a measured tone. Victoria Bennett stepped into the lobby exactly on time. She was in her late 50s, dressed in a charcoal suit, with silver reading glasses hanging from a thin chain around her neck. During 3 decades of practicing family and corporate law, she had built a reputation for winning difficult cases by preparing better than everyone else. She extended her hand. It's been too long, Brian. It has. I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. So am I. She led him into a conference room overlooking the city. Neither reached for coffee. Neither wasted time. Victoria opened a yellow legal pad. I'll ask questions. Answer only what you know. If you're uncertain, tell me you're uncertain. Brian nodded. Understood? Did you confront your wife? No. Did you accuse her? No. Did you record conversations? No. Did you access anything illegally? No. Victoria nodded once. So far, you've made my job much easier. Brian quietly explained everything that had happened. Reservation 4817. Daniel Mercer. The river room. The preserved service logs. Olivia's observations. The archived surveillance footage. The corporate credit card. The approximate statements she remembered hearing. Victoria interrupted only occasionally. Did the cameras record audio? No. Good. She made another note. You don't want audio. Brian looked surprised. Why not? Because surveillance laws become much more complicated. Video documenting ordinary business operations is one thing. Recording private conversations is another. Brian understood immediately. I never wanted to cross that line. I know. She closed one notebook and opened another. Let's talk about assets. Brian slid a leather folder across the table. Inside were neatly organized copies of everything she had requested years earlier when restructuring Hawthorne House. Operating agreements, ownership certificates, trust documents, property records, investment schedules, corporate tax summaries. Victoria slowly reviewed each document. After nearly 20 minutes, she finally looked up. Layla knows about none of this. Only that I consult for restaurants. She believes you're salaried. Yes. Victoria leaned back in her chair. I've handled divorces involving hidden debts. She tapped the folder. I've also handled divorces involving hidden wealth. Brian remained silent. She continued. The law cares why something remained undisclosed. I wasn't hiding assets. I know. You can verify every tax return. I will. Brian folded his hands. I simply never talked about ownership. Victoria smiled faintly. That's very different. She continued reading. Finally, she reached the shareholder register. You own 63%. Correct. And the remaining shares, Employee Trust Harold Whitmore's Family Foundation and 2 minority investors. Victoria nodded. Hawthorne House is substantially more valuable than most privately owned restaurants. Brian shrugged slightly. I never measured my life by that. I'm aware. She closed the folder. Unfortunately, other people often do. Another hour passed, reviewing finances. Every checking account, every investment account, retirement funds, insurance policies, nothing unusual appeared, until Victoria reached the joint household accounts. She frowned. When was this transfer made? Brian looked. 3 weeks earlier. $48,000. Transferred from their joint savings account into an unfamiliar investment account. I don't recognize it. Victoria highlighted the entry. Did you authorize this? No. Did Layla mention it? No. She opened online banking records. Another transfer, $11,000, then another, $22,000. Each withdrawal remained below amounts likely to trigger automatic bank alerts. Victoria stopped writing. Interesting. Brian watched quietly. Someone has been moving money carefully. She looked toward him. Not recklessly. Strategically. Brian felt no anger, only disappointment. Can we trace the destination? Victoria smiled. That's why accountants exist. She picked up her office phone. Ask Michael Grant if he's available. 10 minutes later, Michael Grant entered, carrying a laptop. He was in his early 60s, meticulous, soft-spoken, and had worked alongside Victoria for nearly 2 decades. After brief introductions, Victoria summarized the situation. Michael reviewed the financial records without speaking for several minutes. Then he enlarged one transaction. This account receives recurring deposits. Brian leaned forward. From where? Michael opened another screen. A consulting company. Victoria read the name aloud. Midwest Strategic Advisors. Brian had never heard of it. Michael typed another search. The company had existed only 18 months. Very little public information appeared. 1 registered office, no employees listed, minimal corporate filings. Victoria looked at Brian. Does Layla perform consulting work? No. Have you ever heard her mention this company? Never. Michael continued tracing the account. Then another name appeared. Mercer Logistics Group. The room became quiet. Victoria leaned closer to the monitor. Explain. Michael enlarged the payment history. Mercer Logistics issued recurring consulting payments to Midwest Strategic Advisors. Brian looked carefully. What does Midwest Strategic Advisors actually do? Michael shook his head. I can't tell. No public projects? None. No obvious clients? No. Victoria tapped the desk gently. This may be nothing. She paused. Or it may become something. Brian understood. Assumptions helped no one. Evidence mattered. Michael opened another spreadsheet. The transfer pattern is unusual. In what way? The deposits arrive from Mercer Logistics. They move into Midwest Strategic Advisors. Then portions move into personal investment accounts. Brian looked toward Victoria. Layla's. We don't know yet. Michael nodded. Exactly. Victoria folded her hands. Until we have documentation, we make no conclusions. Brian appreciated hearing those words. Too many people built cases around suspicions. Victoria built them around proof. She turned back toward him. I have advice. I'm listening. Beginning today, do not monitor Layla. I wasn't planning to. Do not search her phone. I won't. Do not access personal email. I won't. Do not hire private investigators. Brian looked surprised. No. Not yet. She smiled slightly. Your strongest evidence already comes from legitimate sources. The restaurant. Exactly. She pointed towards the folder. Business records? Financial disclosures? Lawful documentation? Those carry enormous credibility. Brian nodded. Victoria continued. If someone else has committed financial misconduct, investigators will discover it. We don't need to invent shortcuts. Michael looked up from his laptop. I found another coincidence. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Daniel Mercer's corporate expense reports include multiple executive dinners. Where? Michael turned the screen. Hawthorne House. Brian stared quietly at the list. There were 9 entries over the past 7 months. Different dates, different expense amounts, every dinner categorized as client development. Victoria noticed Brian's expression. Were all of those legitimate business meetings? Brian answered honestly. I don't know. Michael scrolled farther. But now we have something worth comparing. Brian looked toward him. Comparing. Michael nodded. The restaurant's reservation history. Victoria immediately understood. If Mercer Logistics submitted business expenses, the restaurant's reservation records should identify who attended. Michael smiled. Exactly. Brian thought back to the preserved operational records. Reservation names, guest counts, private room assignments, payment methods, every detail routinely maintained, not because of Layla, because Hawthorne House documented everything. Victoria closed the laptop gently. Brian? Yes. Your marriage and Daniel Mercer's business practices may be entirely separate issues. They may. But if they intersect... She paused. We let accountants determine that. Brian stood. So, what happens next? Victoria gathered the folders into neat stacks. You continue living normally. You continue running your restaurant. You continue saying nothing. She handed Michael several documents. You compare Mercer Logistics expense reports against Hawthorne House records. Michael nodded. I'll start this afternoon. Victoria walked Brian toward the conference room door. Patience is difficult. Brian smiled faintly. I've had plenty of practice. She looked directly at him. I believe you. As Brian stepped into the hallway, his phone vibrated. A text message from Layla. Working late again tonight? Don't wait up. Hope your day went well. Brian stared at the message for several seconds. Then he locked the screen without replying. Inside the conference room behind him, Michael suddenly called Victoria's name. She turned back. What is it? Michael was staring at the spreadsheet. His expression had completely changed. I think we just found the first discrepancy. Victoria walked quickly toward him. Brian remained standing in the doorway as Michael slowly turned the laptop around. One expense report claimed Daniel Mercer hosted 6 corporate clients at Hawthorne House. The restaurant reservation for that exact evening listed only 2 guests. One of them was Daniel Mercer. The other name was redacted for privacy in the archived reservation summary. Victoria looked at Brian, then back at the screen. Quietly, she said 4 words. This just became bigger. Brian left Victoria's office just before 5 in the afternoon, but Michael Grant's final words stayed with him all the way back to Hawthorne House. This discrepancy is enough to justify asking more questions. It is not enough to answer them. That distinction mattered. Brian had watched enough businesses collapse because someone rushed toward conclusions instead of facts. He refused to become one of those people. Rush hour traffic crawled through downtown Chicago. By the time he reached the restaurant, the dinner staff had already begun arriving for another busy evening. Emily Carter met him outside the operations office. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson." "Anything unusual?" "Not yet." She handed him the reservation report. "No Mercer Logistics reservations tonight?" Brian nodded. "Good." Emily studied him for a moment. "You look tired." "I slept less than usual." "I hope today was productive." It was. That was all he said. Inside the office, Brian reviewed the previous evening's archived records one more time. Reservation 4,817. Guest count 2. Arrival 7:11 p.m. Departure 8:49 p.m. Private dining room river room. Payment method: Mercer Logistics Corporate American Express. Everything had been preserved exactly as it existed before anyone knew it might matter. That alone gave Brian a sense of confidence. Evidence collected during ordinary business operations always carried more weight than evidence created after conflict began. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus Reed stepped inside wearing his white chef's coat. "I've got a supplier asking about next month's seafood contract." Brian looked up. "Everything within budget," Marcus smiled. "Actually below budget." "Then renew it." Marcus hesitated. "You sure you're all right?" Brian almost laughed. Restaurant employees noticed everything. Not because they were curious, because hospitality depended upon reading people. "I'm fine." Marcus wasn't convinced, but he accepted the answer. "If you need anything." "I know." After Marcus left, Brian returned to reviewing expense summaries. Not his own, the restaurant's. Every corporate dinner produced a predictable trail. Reservation request, guest count, server assignment, kitchen production log, wine inventory, printed receipt, credit card authorization, digital archive. Those records existed because Hawthorne House had spent decades protecting itself against billing disputes. Now they protected something else entirely. At 6:37 p.m., Michael Grant called. "I've continued comparing expense reports." Brian closed the office door. "What did you find?" The discrepancy wasn't isolated. Brian waited. "There are 9 Mercer Logistics executive dinners submitted for reimbursement over the last 7 months. I know. I've matched all 9 against Hawthorne House reservation records." And Michael paused. "Only 2 of them match the expense reports." Brian remained silent. "The other 7 don't." "In what way?" Michael opened another document. "Several reports claim meetings involving 5 or 6 clients." Brian listened carefully. "The restaurant records show only 2 guests." "The same 2, Michael answered immediately. "Daniel Mercer." A pause, and a second guest listed only as Miss L. Brian looked toward the office window. "Why only initials?" "Because Hawthorne House's privacy policy automatically abbreviates guest names added by the reservation holder." Brian remembered implementing that policy himself. Celebrity guests appreciated discretion. Apparently so had Daniel Mercer. Michael continued. That still isn't proof of fraud. No. But it raises legitimate questions. Brian nodded despite being alone. What about payment amounts? Interesting there too. Michael explained that Mercer Logistics had reimbursed Daniel for meals supposedly involving multiple executives, premium wine service, and additional guests. Actual restaurant bills were significantly lower, sometimes by several $1,000s. Brian understood immediately. Someone had inflated corporate expense claims. Whether Daniel acted alone remained unknown. Victoria has already contacted Mercer Logistics' outside compliance counsel. Brian frowned. Already? She believes they should know before litigation complicates matters. Did she mention my marriage? No. Only accounting inconsistencies. Brian appreciated that. His personal life and potential corporate misconduct deserved separate treatment unless evidence connected them. When will compliance respond? They requested supporting documentation tomorrow morning. Brian looked again at the archived reservation files. They'll receive it. After ending the call, Brian walked downstairs into the dining room. He rarely spent entire evenings inside the office. A restaurant revealed its true condition on the floor. Servers greeted regular customers by name. Bartenders remembered favorite bourbons. Managers adjusted reservations without disturbing guests. That rhythm mattered. As Brian crossed the dining room, Olivia Brooks approached quietly. I received an email this afternoon. From whom? A law firm. Brian stopped walking. They requested certified copies of operational records. For reservation 4,817 inches. She nodded. I told them all requests require ownership approval. You handled it correctly. She lowered her voice. I assume this relates to Tuesday night? Brian answered honestly. It may. She looked uncomfortable. I don't like being involved. I don't want you involved. She seemed relieved. If anyone asks questions, Brian continued, answer only what you personally observed. No opinions. No assumptions. Only facts. Olivia smiled faintly. That's exactly what Emily said you'd tell me. Brian smiled back. Emily knows me well. As dinner service continued, another email arrived from Victoria. Compliance Counsel has requested a confidential meeting tomorrow morning. Please bring only original restaurant records. Do not prepare summaries. Do not speculate. Brian closed the message. Again, Victoria insisted on the same principle. Original evidence. Nothing more. Nothing less. The next morning, Brian carried a single, locked document case into the offices of Mercer Logistics' outside compliance firm. Victoria waited inside the conference room. Michael Grant sat beside several neatly organized spreadsheets. Across the table were three unfamiliar people. A woman introduced herself first. Angela Foster, Chief Compliance Officer. Next came an older man. Robert Klein, outside corporate counsel. Finally, a forensic accountant. Samuel Ortiz. No one mentioned Layla. No one mentioned infidelity. This meeting concerned numbers. Angela opened. Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. Brian nodded politely. We understand Hawthorne House maintains comprehensive operational records. Yes. We're reviewing certain executive expense reports submitted by Mercer Logistics. Victoria spoke before Brian answered. My client is here only to authenticate ordinary business records. Angela nodded. That's all we're requesting. Brian unlocked the document case. Inside were certified copies arranged chronologically, reservation confirmations, guest counts, receipts, wine invoices, service logs, kitchen timestamps. Everything bore the restaurant's official certification stamp. Samuel Ortiz reviewed the first file, then another, then another. His expression gradually changed. He reached the fourth reservation. This invoice shows 2 guests. Correct. He opened the corresponding Mercer Logistics expense report. The report claimed 6 executives attended. Angela leaned forward. Can restaurant records be altered? Brian answered calmly. Not without leaving permanent audit logs. Samuel immediately asked, Do you retain those logs? Every edit. Were there edits? Brian slid another document across the table. No. Samuel studied it carefully. Interesting. Angela exchanged a glance with Robert Klein. The room became noticeably quieter. Another report. Another discrepancy. Another. 7 separate occasions. Every inconsistency favored Daniel Mercer's reimbursement claims, not the restaurant. Finally, Angela closed the last folder. Mr. Thompson. Yes. I appreciate your professionalism. Brian simply nodded. Robert Klein spoke next. We'll need additional documentation. Of course. But not from you. Brian looked toward him. We'll obtain the remaining records directly through internal corporate procedures. Victoria quietly closed Brian's document case. Our involvement ends here unless legally requested. Angela stood. I suspect it doesn't. Brian remained expressionless. He had not come seeking revenge. He had simply answered lawful requests. As he prepared to leave, Samuel called after him. One more question. Brian turned. Were these records preserved recently? Yes. For what reason? Brian answered truthfully. They were part of a routine operational preservation request. Samuel nodded slowly. You may have saved evidence without realizing how important it would become. Brian offered no response. Outside the building, Victoria walked beside him toward the elevator. Neither spoke until the doors closed. Then she looked directly at him. They're opening a formal internal investigation. Brian stared at the descending floor numbers. Into Daniel Mercer. Victoria shook her head. No. She paused. Into the entire executive expense system. Brian understood what that meant. The affair had uncovered something much larger than a broken marriage. Somewhere inside Mercer, logistics years of overlooked records were beginning to unravel. And if Daniel Mercer had built his career on the assumption that no one would ever compare his stories to the quiet records of a restaurant owner he had never bothered to notice, that assumption was about to become the most expensive mistake of his life. Brian returned to Hawthorne House with a clearer mind than he had possessed in days. The situation had grown more complicated, but it had also become more defined. There were now 2 separate tracks moving forward. One belonged to his marriage, the other belonged to Mercer Logistics. They might eventually intersect. They might not. Either way, Brian intended to let evidence determine where each path led. By Friday evening, Hawthorne House was operating at full capacity. Every private dining room had been reserved. The lounge buzzed with conversations between attorneys, finishing another week of negotiations, physicians celebrating promotions, and tourists who had spent months trying to secure reservations. Brian walked through the dining room as he always did. He greeted employees. He checked table spacing. He adjusted the lighting in one corner, where a new fixture seemed slightly brighter than the others. To every customer, he appeared to be exactly what they assumed he was, a meticulous operations manager. Nothing more. That anonymity remained one of his greatest advantages. As he entered the operations office, Emily Carter stood waiting beside his desk. I received an unusual phone call. Brian removed his jacket. From whom? A woman who identified herself as Jennifer Collins. The name meant nothing to him. What did she want? She asked whether Hawthorne House could verify executive dinner reservations from Mercer Logistics. Brian looked at Emily carefully. What did you tell her? Exactly what our policy requires. She handed him a note. I explained that guest information remains confidential unless we receive a lawful request. Brian nodded approvingly. Did she leave a number? Emily pointed to the handwritten note. She said she works in Mercer Logistics' internal audit department. Brian studied the paper. So they've already begun. It seems that way. Emily hesitated. Should I expect more calls? Probably. What should I do? The same thing you did today. No exceptions? She smiled. I thought you'd say that. Brian appreciated employees who respected procedures, even when curiosity tempted them otherwise. Rules existed precisely for difficult situations. After Emily left, Brian opened the reservation system again. He searched every Mercer Logistics booking from the previous year. 12 appeared. 9 under Daniel Mercer, 3 under other executives. The differences became obvious almost immediately. Other executives reserved larger tables, different attendees appeared each time, different payment methods, different meeting purposes. Daniel's reservations followed an entirely different pattern. Always 2 guests, always private rooms, always maximum privacy, always weekday evenings, always submitted later as executive business expenses. Brian printed nothing. He simply closed the file. The investigators would discover the same pattern soon enough. At home that evening, Layla seemed unusually cheerful. She had ordered takeout from a nearby Italian restaurant. Candles burned on the dining table. Soft music played from the living room speakers. It looked almost like an apology, or perhaps an attempt to restore normality. Brian could not tell. I'm glad you're home early, she said. So am I. She served pasta onto both plates. I feel like we've both been working too much. Brian met her eyes. We probably have. For several minutes, they spoke only about ordinary things. The weather, weekend grocery shopping, Cooper's upcoming veterinary appointment. It almost resembled the marriage they once shared. Then Layla casually asked, How's the restaurant? Brian paused for only a fraction of a second. Busy. Still consulting there? Every week. She nodded while twirling pasta around her fork. They're lucky to have someone dependable. Brian noticed the wording. Not successful, not respected, dependable. It reflected exactly how she still viewed him, a reliable employee, someone who solved other people's problems, someone who would never own anything significant. You've always liked that place, she continued. I have. I've heard executives eat there all the time. They do, she smiled. I've never actually seen the private rooms. Brian held her gaze. They're nice. You should take me someday. For the first time since Tuesday night, Brian felt something deeper than disappointment. Not anger, sadness. She had eaten in one of those private rooms only 3 nights earlier. Now she was speaking as though she had never seen them. He answered simply, Maybe. The conversation moved on. Neither acknowledged the lie that had quietly passed between them. After dinner, Layla carried the dishes into the kitchen. Brian remained at the table. His phone vibrated. Victoria Bennett. He stepped onto the back patio before answering. Good evening. We have an update. Brian listened. Compliance has suspended Daniel Mercer pending the investigation. So quickly. They uncovered enough accounting inconsistencies to justify immediate administrative leave. Brian looked across the quiet neighborhood. What about criminal allegations? None. Not yet. She emphasized the final words. This is still an internal investigation. And Layla? Not mentioned. Brian felt an unexpected sense of relief. Victoria continued. However, he waited. Internal auditors are interviewing employees who approved Daniel's expense reports. So the investigation is expanding. Yes, she paused. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Has Layla shown any unusual behavior since Tuesday? Brian considered the question carefully. Nothing dramatic. Any financial activity? I haven't checked. Good. Don't. He understood immediately. She wanted him to avoid actions that might later appear intrusive. Instead, she asked, "Has she mentioned Daniel Mercer?" No. Has she mentioned problems at work? No. Victoria sighed quietly. Then continue exactly as you have. No confrontation. Not until we know everything. Brian ended the call and remained outside for several minutes. Through the kitchen window, he could see Layla drying dishes. She looked completely relaxed. If she knew Daniel had been suspended, she showed no sign of it. Either she hadn't heard yet, or she had become very skilled at hiding her reactions. The following Monday morning, Mercer Logistics officially announced that Daniel Mercer would be taking an indefinite leave of absence, while the company conducted an internal review of executive expense procedures. The announcement appeared only inside the company's employee portal. It did not reach the news. Not yet. Brian learned about it from Michael Grant. So it's public internally, Brian said. Correct. And externally. Still confidential. Michael lowered his voice. There's something else. What? We've traced several transfers from Midwest Strategic Advisors. Brian listened carefully. They weren't random. Where did they go? 3 investment accounts. Brian waited. 1 belongs to Daniel Mercer. 1 belongs to Midwest Strategic Advisors. And the 3rd, Michael stopped. Brian felt his heartbeat slow. The 3rd belongs to someone named L. Harper. Brian frowned. Harper? Yes. Not Thompson. Not Thompson. Brian repeated the name silently. Layla Harper. Her maiden name. She had never closed one of her old brokerage accounts after they married. He remembered helping her organize paperwork years earlier. Michael continued. We still don't know whether those transfers were legitimate. But now we know the destination. Brian leaned back in his chair. For the first time since that dinner in the river room, a direct financial connection had appeared. Not proof of wrongdoing. Not yet. But a documented connection. Michael's final sentence lingered after the call ended. The auditors don't know about the account owner yet. Brian looked toward the dining room below, where guests laughed over lunch, and sunlight reflected through the tall windows overlooking the Chicago River. Somewhere across the city, Layla was probably beginning another ordinary workday. She almost certainly believed Tuesday night's dinner had disappeared into the past. She still had no idea that the quiet restaurant she had chosen had preserved every ordinary business record. She still believed her husband was merely a dependable consultant, and she had no reason to suspect that investigators had just followed a trail of financial transfers directly to an investment account opened under the name she had carried long before she became Layla Thompson. Brian did not call Layla that afternoon. He did not ask where she was. He did not ask whether Daniel Mercer had returned to work. The questions could wait. Answers gathered under pressure often became unreliable. Answers gathered through ordinary events usually revealed far more. That philosophy had guided every business decision Brian had made for over a decade. It would guide this one as well. Late Tuesday morning, Victoria Bennett called again. They've reached out to Layla. Brian looked up from the quarterly inventory report on his desk. As a witness. Officially. What does that mean? Victoria spoke carefully. Mercer Logistics has begun interviewing employees who submitted expense documentation connected to Daniel Mercer. Brian remained quiet. They're not accusing her of anything. Not yet. They're simply asking about travel approvals, marketing budgets, client dinners, and reimbursement procedures. Brian understood. Every investigation started with routine questions. Only later did investigators decide which answers deserved closer examination. Did Layla contact you? No. Has she contacted anyone from Hawthorne House? No. Victoria paused. I expect that to change. After ending the call, Brian returned to the dining room. Lunch service had ended. Emily Carter supervised staff resetting tables for dinner, while Marcus Reed finalized evening prep in the kitchen. Everything appeared normal. That normality comforted Brian. No matter what happened outside these walls, Hawthorne House continued serving guests with the same consistency it always had. Marcus approached carrying a clipboard. New seasonal menu. Brian reviewed the proposed dishes. Roasted duck, wild mushroom risotto, Lake Superior whitefish. He suggested 2 minor adjustments before signing the approval sheet. Marcus smiled. You know. What? I've worked in restaurants for 31 years. Brian waited. I've never met an owner who still edits menu descriptions. Brian looked up. Someone has to notice the details. Marcus laughed. That's why this place succeeds. Owner. The word barely registered anymore. Within the restaurant, only a handful of senior employees used it. Everywhere else, Brian remained simply Brian. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. Harold Whitmore. Although officially retired, the 80-year-old founder still visited Hawthorne House every few weeks. He moved slowly now, leaning lightly on a polished walnut cane, but his sharp blue eyes missed very little. Brian greeted him warmly. It's good to see you. Harold smiled. You look terrible. Brian laughed quietly. I've looked worse. Not emotionally. Harold gestured toward the private office. Walk with me. Once inside, Harold closed the door. I received a phone call from Robert Klein. Brian looked surprised. They contacted you. They wanted background on Hawthorne House's record-keeping. Brian nodded. I expected that eventually. Harold settled into a chair. They also told me you handled yourself professionally. I only provided documents. Exactly. Harold studied Brian for several seconds. Something else is bothering you. Brian considered remaining silent. Instead, he answered honestly. My marriage. Harold slowly nodded. I wondered. Brian briefly summarized the situation. Not dramatically, only facts. The dinner, the surveillance records, the financial investigation. Layla, Daniel Mercer. Harold listened without interrupting. When Brian finished, the older man folded his hands. I've watched people lose fortunes. Brian remained silent. I've watched people lose companies. Harold looked toward the office window. The hardest loss to survive is trust. Brian lowered his eyes. I know. Harold leaned forward. Don't confuse dignity with passivity. Brian looked back at him. They're different. I understand. No. Harold smiled sadly. You understand business. This is personal. Brian waited. When the time comes. Harold spoke slowly. Oh, don't avoid difficult decisions simply because you've avoided emotional ones. The words lingered after Harold left. That evening, Layla called just before 6. Are you still at work? I am. I'll probably be late. Busy. She hesitated. Human resources meetings. Brian noticed the choice of words. Not marketing meetings. Human resources. What happened? I don't really know. She laughed nervously. Everyone seems stressed. Brian answered calmly. I hope everything works out. Me too. She ended the call a minute later. Brian stood motionless for several seconds. That was the first genuine uncertainty he had heard in her voice all week. The following morning, Michael Grant requested an urgent meeting. Brian arrived at Victoria's office shortly after 10. Michael already had several folders spread across the conference table. Victoria entered carrying another file. I think we've reached the point where the two investigations intersect. Brian sat down. Michael opened the first folder. These are Mercer Logistics reimbursement approvals. He slid several pages forward. Every executive expense required 2 signatures. Brian reviewed the documents. Daniel Mercer's signature appeared on each one. Below it appeared another signature. Layla Thompson, Marketing Director. Brian looked at Victoria. Approval doesn't necessarily mean knowledge. Correct, she replied. Keep reading. Michael pointed toward the supporting documentation. Each reimbursement packet contained itemized receipts, client lists, meeting objectives, expense summaries. Brian noticed something immediately. The receipts submitted to Mercer Logistics were not identical to the restaurant's originals. The restaurant logo matched. The date matched. The total did not. Someone had altered the numbers. Michael nodded. Our forensic software confirmed digital modification. Brian studied the pages. So someone changed the receipts after leaving the restaurant. Exactly, Victoria added. The originals remained preserved inside Hawthorne House. Brian understood why that mattered. The authentic records had never left the restaurant's accounting system. Everything submitted later had passed through someone else's hands. Michael continued. There's another issue. He opened a second folder. The names of attending clients. Brian read them carefully. 6 executives, 3 companies, several names repeated across different reimbursement requests. Michael shook his head. We contacted 2 of those companies. Brian looked up. They confirmed no such dinners ever occurred. Silence settled across the room. Victoria finally spoke. This is no longer simply inflated expense claims. Brian understood. It suggested fabricated business meetings, potential document falsification, corporate deception extending far beyond expensive dinners. Michael continued tracing the timeline. The approval chain interests me. Brian listened. Daniel submitted the reports. Layla approved them. Finance reimbursed them. Brian asked the obvious question. Could Layla have approved them without examining every receipt? Victoria answered first. Possibly, Michael agreed. Many companies rely on department heads to verify business purpose rather than authenticate receipts, so approval alone proves very little. Exactly. Brian appreciated hearing restraint instead of speculation. Too many investigators fell in love with theories. Good investigators remained loyal only to evidence. A knock interrupted the meeting. Angela Foster entered carrying another folder. I apologize for interrupting. Victoria gestured toward the empty chair. Angela sat. We completed additional employee interviews this morning. Brian waited. Layla Thompson included. No one spoke. Angela continued. She admitted attending several dinners with Daniel Mercer. Brian felt no visible reaction. But Angela opened her notebook. She stated they were legitimate client planning sessions. Michael frowned. What about the missing clients? She said some attendees canceled. Victoria quietly asked, did she explain why expense reports still listed those absent guests? Angela shook her head. She said Daniel handled reimbursement paperwork. Brian looked toward the window overlooking Chicago. For the first time since the investigation began, Layla's explanation had been placed into an official record. It might be truthful. It might not. But now it could be tested. Angela closed her notebook. There's one final development. Everyone looked toward her. We've obtained a warrant for Daniel Mercer's company laptop. Brian's attention sharpened. The forensic examination begins tomorrow. She stood. If the altered receipts originated there... She left the sentence unfinished. She didn't need to complete it. Everyone in the room understood. If investigators found the original editing files on Daniel's computer, one path emerged. If they discovered the files somewhere else, an entirely different path opened. As Angela left, Victoria quietly looked at Brian. The next 48 hours will answer questions we've been asking for weeks. Brian nodded once. Outside the conference room, rain began falling against the office windows. Inside, 4 people sat surrounded by perfectly organized documents, each page bringing the truth a little closer. None of them yet realized that the most important piece of evidence was not hidden inside a financial report, a corporate laptop, or a bank account. It had been sitting for years inside Hawthorne House's secure reservation archive, waiting for someone to ask one simple question that no one had thought to ask before. The question came from Emily Carter 2 days later. She stood beside Brian in the operations office, reviewing the list of archived Mercer Logistics reservations, while rain pressed against the windows overlooking the Chicago River. Why did Daniel Mercer always request the river room? Brian looked at the screen. Privacy. Emily shook her head. That explains the private room. It doesn't explain why he always chose the same one. Brian waited. Emily enlarged the reservation history. 9 bookings, 7 months, every reservation assigned to the river room. The river room isn't always available, she said. On 3 of these nights, another guest had already reserved it. Brian leaned closer. What happened? The reservations were moved. At whose request? Emily opened the internal notes. Daniel's assistant called each time. She offered to pay the relocation fee for the other party. Brian studied the entries. The details seemed insignificant. Then he noticed something else. Who created these reservations? Emily pointed to the same account name. Jennifer Collins, the internal auditor who had called Hawthorne House days earlier. Brian frowned. Jennifer Collins worked for Daniel. According to the reservation profiles, she was listed as executive support. Brian remembered the note Emily had handed him. Jennifer had identified herself as a member of internal audit. Perhaps she had transferred departments. Perhaps the reservation system contained outdated information. Or perhaps someone else had used her name. Brian called Victoria immediately. She answered on the second ring. What happened? He explained the repeated room requests and Jennifer Collins's connection to the reservations. Victoria remained silent for several seconds. Do nothing. I wasn't planning to. I'm sending this to Angela Foster. Brian looked at the reservation records. Why would the room matter? We don't know that it does. Her voice sharpened slightly. That means we don't guess. Within an hour, Angela arrived at Hawthorne House with Samuel Ortiz and Robert Klein. They entered through the employee garage to avoid attention. Emily led them upstairs. Brian had already prepared secure access to the original reservation database, but he had printed nothing. Samuel sat at the terminal and reviewed the booking history. These records show Jennifer Collins created the reservations. Emily nodded. Through Mercer Logistics' corporate booking profile. Angela exchanged a glance with Robert. Jennifer hasn't worked as Daniel's executive assistant for 14 months. Brian remained quiet. What does she do now? Victoria asked. Internal audit. Samuel opened the profile access logs. Every reservation had been created using the same corporate credentials. The account belonged to Daniel's executive office. Jennifer's name remained attached because no one had updated the administrator field after her transfer. So, Jennifer didn't necessarily create these, Brian said. Correct, Samuel replied. Her name was attached to the account, not the individual action. That eliminated one possible answer. It created another question. Who had used the account? The reservation logs contained Internet protocol addresses, device details, timestamps, and modification histories. Hawthorne House retained them for fraud prevention and charge disputes. Samuel reviewed the first reservation, then the second. His expression tightened. These bookings were not created from Mercer Logistics headquarters. Angela moved closer. Where were they created? Samuel examined the location data. A residential network. He opened another record. The same network every time. Brian felt the room become still. Robert asked the next question. Can you identify the address? Not from the restaurant system alone. Samuel copied the technical identifiers into his notes. But Mercer Logistics may be able to compare them against company devices. Angela called someone from the hallway. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. She listened without speaking. When she returned, her expression was controlled. The device identifier matches a company laptop assigned to Layla Thompson. Brian did not react outwardly. Inside, the conclusion struck with quiet force. Layla had not merely attended Daniel's dinners, she had arranged them. At least her assigned computer had. Victoria immediately raised a hand. That still does not prove she personally made the reservations. Angela nodded. Correct. The laptop could have been used by someone else. Correct. Brian appreciated the precision. Every answer created limits around itself. Facts were strongest when no one stretched them beyond what they proved. Samuel returned to the reservation records. There's more. He opened the special request history. Each booking contained a coded note, R12 service required. Emily frowned. That isn't one of our current service codes. Brian recognized it. It was used under the old reservation system. Everyone looked toward him. He searched his memory. Before Hawthorne House's renovation, private room guests could request specialized business services. Projectors, secure conference phones, document shredding, courier pickup. Those services had been removed years earlier. What did R12 mean? Angela asked. Brian opened the archived operations manual. After several minutes, he found it. R12 secure document holding. Robert leaned forward. Explain. Brian read the old policy. Guests could place sealed business documents inside the restaurant's secure overnight safe. A registered courier could retrieve them the following morning. Does that service still exist? No. Then why was the code used? Emily opened the service logs. Because someone on the reservation account kept requesting it. Brian looked at her. Did staff provide the service? No, each request was marked unavailable. Samuel scrolled through the notes. Except once. The room fell silent. One reservation from 8 months earlier had been processed by a temporary evening manager unfamiliar with the discontinued code. The service note stated that a sealed envelope had been accepted and placed in secure compartment 4. Courier pickup had been scheduled for the next morning. Brian remembered the safe. It still stood inside the basement records room. Most compartments had not been used in years. Who collected the envelope? Angela asked. Emily checked the log. No one. The pickup had been canceled. The envelope should have been returned to the reservation holder. No return was documented. Brian stood. The group followed him into the service elevator. They descended 2 levels below the dining room into a narrow basement corridor containing wine storage maintenance equipment and old administrative files. The records room required 2 electronic access cards. Brian used his. Emily used hers. The door opened. At the back of the room stood a heavy steel safe built into the wall. Brian entered the administrator code. Its internal light switched on. Most compartments were empty. Compartment 4 was locked. The digital log showed no access since the night the temporary manager placed something inside. Victoria stopped Brian before he touched it. Do not open that. He withdrew his hand. It's restaurant property. The compartment is. She looked at the others. The contents may belong to someone else. Robert agreed. We need documented legal authority. Angela called Mercer Logistics Council. Victoria contacted a judge through an emergency evidence preservation process. No one moved the safe. No one entered the compartment. They photographed the exterior, recorded the access history, and sealed the records room. Brian returned upstairs while the attorneys handled the paperwork. Dinner service had begun. Guests filled the main dining room unaware that an old steel compartment 2 floors below had just become the center of a corporate investigation. At 8:26 p.m., Victoria received the court authorization. She, Brian, Angela, Robert, Samuel, and Emily returned to the basement. A certified evidence officer joined them. Every action was recorded. Every person signed the access sheet. Brian entered the code. The officer opened compartment 4. Inside rested a single cream-colored envelope. No address, no company logo, only 2 handwritten initials. DM. The officer photographed it before lifting it out. The envelope remained sealed. Robert examined the chain of custody log. Open it. The officer carefully cut along one edge. Inside were photocopies of corporate invoices, handwritten account numbers, and a list of vendor payments. Samuel read the first page, then the second. His face hardened. These aren't restaurant expenses. Angela stepped closer. What are they? Samuel pointed to a series of payments issued by Mercer Logistics to transportation subcontractors. The companies appeared unrelated. The bank account numbers suggested otherwise. Several payments flowed into accounts connected to Midwest Strategic Advisors, the same shell company Michael Grant had already identified. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten distribution schedule. 40% assigned to DM, 20% assigned to LH. The rest divided among 3 unfamiliar initials. Brian stared at the letters. LH Layla Harper. Her maiden name. Still, he said nothing. Initials were not identities. Not yet. The evidence officer placed every page inside protective sleeves. Angela looked toward Brian. This may establish a procurement fraud scheme. Victoria added calmly. It may also establish nothing until the account's handwriting and names are authenticated. Brian nodded. Facts first, meaning later. As they prepared to leave, Samuel noticed a small line written beneath the distribution schedule. Next transfer after Thompson filing. He read it twice, then looked directly at Brian. What filing? Brian knew immediately. The divorce filing Layla had apparently planned before entering the river room. The dinner had not merely concerned an affair. It had not merely concerned leaving him. Someone had expected a legal filing to trigger the next movement of money. Brian felt the betrayal settle into a colder shape. Layla and Daniel had believed he would never see it coming. They had been right about one thing. He had not. But they had chosen the one restaurant in Chicago where forgotten records remained preserved, old procedures left permanent logs, and the quiet man they dismissed controlled every system capable of exposing what they had hidden. Before Brian could speak, his phone vibrated. A process server was waiting at his home. Layla Thompson had officially filed for divorce. Brian arrived home at 9:12 p.m. The process server waited beneath the porch light, holding a large white envelope against his chest. Brian Thompson. Yes. The man handed him the documents. You've been served. Brian accepted them calmly. No argument, no questions, no visible reaction. The server recorded the time returned to his car and drove away. Brian remained outside for several seconds. Through the front window, the living room lights glowed warmly. Cooper stood behind the glass, his tail moving with innocent excitement. Nothing about the house looked different. Yet the marriage inside it had already become a legal case. Brian entered. Layla was not home. He placed the envelope on the dining table and fed Cooper before opening it. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The first page contained familiar information. Names, address, marriage date, no children. Irreconcilable differences. The language was cold and standardized. The financial section was not. Layla stated that Brian worked as a restaurant consultant with moderate annual income. She requested the marital home, a division of joint savings, temporary maintenance, attorney fees. She also requested protection against the dissipation of marital assets. Brian read that sentence twice. Layla was asking the court to prevent him from hiding or spending money. The accusation would have been almost ironic if the circumstances had not been so serious. The petition listed her own employment income. It did not list the investment account under Layla Harper. It did not mention Midwest Strategic Advisors. It did not mention transfers from Mercer Logistics. Brian photographed the envelope exactly where it rested on the table. Then he called Victoria. She answered immediately. "You were served. 9:12 tonight. Have you opened it?" "Yes." "Do not sign anything." "I won't." "Do not discuss the petition with Layla." Brian looked toward the driveway. "She's not home." "Good." Victoria paused. "I need a complete digital copy. I'll send it from my office scanner." "Not tonight." Brian frowned. "Why?" "Because you don't need to spend the next 3 hours analyzing every sentence. I've already read it. Once is enough." Her tone softened. Brian legal documents are designed to make emotional situations look administrative. That doesn't mean you should treat yourself like a machine. He said nothing. Victoria continued. "Put the papers somewhere secure, feed your dog, sleep. And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow we answer." Layla returned shortly before midnight. Brian heard her car enter the garage. He was sitting in the living room with the television turned off. The divorce papers rested inside a locked desk drawer. Layla stepped into the house carrying her handbag and a thin laptop case. She stopped when she saw him. For the first time, her practiced confidence disappeared. "You got the papers?" It was not a question. Brian looked at her calmly. "Yes." Layla placed the laptop case beside the hallway table. "I wanted to tell you first." "But you didn't." She lowered her eyes. "My attorney advised against it." Brian thought of Victoria's instructions. No confrontation, no emotional statements, no discussion of evidence. He remained quiet. Layla removed her coat slowly. "This doesn't have to become ugly." Brian studied her expression. She looked nervous but not devastated, prepared, as though this conversation had been rehearsed somewhere else. "I agree," he said. Relief flickered across her face. "We've grown apart." Brian offered no response. "We both know that." He still said nothing. Layla continued because silence demanded more than she expected. "You live for work." "You've always been satisfied with the less. You don't want the same future I want." Brian finally spoke. "What future is that?" She hesitated. "Security." The word settled between them. Brian almost looked around the room. The house had no mortgage. Their retirement accounts were funded. Their joint savings exceeded what most families accumulated in a decade. But Layla believed security meant something else. Status. Visible wealth. The kind of life people recognized before they understood it. "You believe I couldn't give you security?" he asked. Layla sighed. "This isn't about blaming you." Brian noticed she had not answered. She sat across from him. "My attorney says we can settle quickly." "Your attorney doesn't represent me." "No, of course not." She folded her hands. "But there isn't much to divide." Brian looked directly at her. "What do you believe there is?" "The house." "Our savings." "Or retirement accounts." She paused. "Your consulting income?" "Nothing else. No restaurant, no ownership shares, no holding company, no private investment portfolio." Layla had filed for divorce believing she understood Brian's entire financial life. She did not. "What about your assets?" he asked. Her expression changed slightly. "My assets." "Your accounts." "We've always kept some things separate. List them in your financial disclosure." She leaned back. Obviously, Brian recognized another careful answer. Not denial, not transparency. A promise about a future document she had not yet submitted. Layla stood. "I'll sleep in the guest room." Brian nodded. That makes sense. She lifted her laptop case from the hallway. At the foot of the stairs, she turned. I really am sorry. Brian watched her. For filing. For how this ended. He thought of the river room, the missing wedding ring, the financial transfers, the handwritten initials, the line beneath the distribution schedule. Next transfer after Thompson filing. This hasn't ended yet, he said. Layla's face tightened. Brian did not explain. She walked upstairs without another word. The following morning, Brian arrived at Victoria's office before 8. She read the petition in complete silence. Michael Grant sat at the far end of the conference table, reviewing preliminary financial reports. When Victoria finished, she removed her glasses. She has created several problems for herself. Brian remained composed. Which ones? First, she has requested sworn financial disclosures. Victoria tapped the petition. That means both parties must reveal income debts, accounts, business interests, and major transfers. Brian understood. She'll discover Hawthorne House. Yes. When? Soon. He had always known that moment would come. Still, knowing it approached felt different. Victoria continued. Second, she alleged concern about hidden marital assets, which allows us to request broader financial discovery. Michael looked up. Including the investment account under Layla Harper. Brian nodded. And the third problem, Victoria's expression hardened. Timing. She pointed to the filing date. The petition was submitted yesterday morning. Brian looked at it again. Several hours before the envelope had been opened inside Hawthorne House's basement safe. Several hours before anyone discovered the handwritten distribution schedule. Michael turned his laptop around. There was another transfer yesterday afternoon. Brian read the entry. $125,000 had moved from Midwest Strategic Advisors into the L. Harper investment account. The transfer occurred 43 minutes after Layla's divorce petition was officially filed. The room became silent. The handwritten note had not described a vague future plan. It had described a specific trigger. Next transfer after Thompson filing. Victoria leaned back. Now we have timing. Michael added, and account records. Brian looked at the transaction. Do investigators know? They do now. At 9:17 a.m., Angela Foster called Victoria. The forensic team had completed its initial examination of Daniel Mercer's company laptop. Altered restaurant receipts were found inside a hidden folder. So were vendor invoices, payment schedules, encrypted communications. But the most damaging files had not been created on Daniel's computer. They had been received from another Mercer logistics device, a laptop assigned to Layla Thompson. Victoria placed the call on speaker. Angela's voice remained controlled. We also recovered messages discussing the divorce filing. Brian stared at the conference table. What did they say? Angela paused. Daniel asked whether Brian knew the real value of the assets. Victoria looked at Brian. And Layla's response? Another pause. Then Angela read the recovered message. He thinks I married a man who never became anything. No one spoke. Angela continued. There's one more message. Brian waited. This time her voice sounded almost reluctant. Layla wrote, once the filing is complete, I can force Discovery find whatever he's hiding and use the settlement to protect our new life. The contradiction was complete. Layla had believed Brian possessed nothing significant, yet she had also suspected he might be hiding something. She had filed not only to leave him, she had filed to search him. Victoria ended the call and closed the petition. She expects Discovery to expose you. Brian looked toward the Chicago skyline beyond the windows. It will. Michael appeared uncertain. Does that concern you? Brian thought about the years of silence, the hidden ownership, the modest car, the ordinary clothes, the wife who believed patience meant failure. "No," he said. For the first time in days, a quiet certainty entered his voice. "She asked the court for the truth." Victoria slowly nodded. Brian looked back at the divorce petition. Now she gets all of it. Brian's formal response to the divorce petition was filed 4 days later. It contained no accusations of infidelity, no mention of Daniel Mercer, no reference to the corporate investigation. Victoria kept the document narrow and precise. Brian admitted the marriage had broken down. He denied Layla's request for temporary maintenance. He requested an equitable division of marital property. He asked the court to preserve all financial accounts until both parties completed sworn disclosures. Most importantly, he reserved the right to raise claims involving undisclosed assets and dissipation after discovery. Layla's attorney received the response at 9:06 a.m. At 9:41, Victoria's office received a phone call. Victoria placed it on speaker while Brian sat across from her conference table. A man introduced himself as Charles Whitman, counsel for Layla Thompson. His voice was confident, professional, slightly impatient. "We received your client's response." Victoria leaned back. "I assumed you would. Mrs. Thompson wants an efficient resolution." "So does Mr. Thompson." Charles continued. "My client is prepared to offer him half the joint savings and allow him to retain his retirement account." Brian said nothing. Victoria looked at the proposed figures. "And the marital home?" "Mrs. Thompson would retain it, without buying out his equity. She believes the arrangement is fair considering her anticipated need for stability." Victoria's expression did not change. "My client has an equal interest in the property." Charles paused. "We were under the impression Mr. Thompson's financial position was limited." Victoria glanced toward Brian. "Your impressions are not financial disclosures." Another silence followed. Charles changed direction. "Then perhaps we should exchange documents quickly." "We agree." "How soon can your client provide complete asset information?" Victoria closed the folder in front of her. "Tomorrow." Charles sounded surprised. "Tomorrow?" "My client maintains excellent records." Brian almost smiled. The call ended with an agreement to exchange preliminary disclosures the following afternoon. Victoria turned toward him. "Once they receive this, everything changes." On the table rested 3 thick binders. The first contained personal assets. The second contained business interests. The third contained supporting tax records, valuation summaries, and ownership agreements. Brian looked at them without emotion. "I knew this day would come." Victoria studied him. "Are you ready for Layla to know?" He considered the question. For years, his privacy had protected more than money. It had protected his ability to see people clearly. Employees spoke honestly around him because he did not arrive in expensive cars. Vendors negotiated with him because they believed he understood margins. Guests passed him in the dining room without recognizing the owner. Layla had done the same inside their marriage. She had judged his quietness as limitation, his modesty as lack of ambition, his patience as weakness. Now court procedure would remove every assumption. "I'm ready," he said. The disclosures were delivered at 2:00 p.m. the next day. At 2:17, Charles Whitman called Victoria. She did not answer. At 2:21, he called again. At 2:29, his assistant emailed, requesting an urgent conference. Victoria waited until 3:00. Then she returned the call with Brian present. Charles spoke immediately. "We need clarification regarding Hawthorne Hospitality Holdings," Victoria replied calmly. "The documents are clear. Your client owns 63% of Hawthorne House. Through the holding company, yes." Charles shuffled papers in the background. "The valuation report lists the business interest at $28 million. That is the current conservative estimate." Brian heard another voice in Charles's office. "Layla, Her words were too distant to understand, but her tone was unmistakable, sharp, disbelieving. Charles lowered his voice. Was this ownership acquired during the marriage? Partially. Victoria opened the ownership timeline. Some shares were purchased with Brian's premarital savings and inherited property proceeds. Additional shares were acquired through distributions, reinvested earnings, and later transactions. The classification will require tracing. Charles responded more carefully. So you're claiming a substantial non-marital component. We are documenting one. And Mrs. Thompson knew nothing. Victoria looked at Brian. That question belongs to your client. The distant voice became louder. This time Layla's words were clear. He told me he worked there. Brian remained still. Charles muted the call. Several minutes passed. When he returned, his confidence had weakened. We may need additional time to review. The disclosure deadline applies equally to both parties, Victoria said. My client's records will be produced. All of them. Of course. Victoria's eyes hardened, including accounts held under previous legal names. Silence. Charles understood the warning. The L. Harper account could no longer remain outside the discussion. We'll respond appropriately, he said. The call ended. Brian looked toward Victoria. How long before Layla confronts me? Not long. She was correct. At 5:36 p.m., Layla called. Brian was inside Hawthorne House's operations office reviewing payroll. He let the phone ring twice before answering. Hello? What did you do? Her voice shook with anger. Brian closed the payroll file. What are you referring to? Hawthorne House. What about it? You own it. He looked through the office window towards the main dining room. Servers moved between tables. Marcus stood near the kitchen entrance, discussing a plate with a sous chef. Emily greeted an elderly couple celebrating their anniversary. Yes, Brian said. Layla released a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. $28 million. That's a business valuation. You let me believe you were an employee. I told you I worked there. That's not the same thing. No. Brian did not defend himself further. Layla filled the silence. How long? I began purchasing shares years ago. Before we married. Some of them. And you never thought your wife deserved to know. Brian considered his answer. I thought my wife knew who I was without needing a valuation report. Layla went quiet. For a moment, only the low sounds of the restaurant remained. Then she asked, Did you hide it because you didn't trust me? No. Then why? Because I wanted a private life. We were married, Brian. Yes. Her voice sharpened. You made me look like a fool. Brian's expression remained calm. I haven't discussed our finances with anyone outside the people legally required to know. You sat there while I talked about money. You never asked what I owned. I shouldn't have needed to. Maybe not. That answer seemed to anger her more than an argument would have. You knew I wanted more. Brian looked toward the city beyond the windows. You wanted something visible. I wanted a husband with ambition. I rebuilt a failing restaurant. I invested everything I had. I became majority owner. His voice remained quiet. You decided that wasn't ambition because you couldn't see it? Layla had no immediate response. Brian continued. You saw my car, my clothes, my schedule. You measured my life from the outside. That's not fair. Neither is filing sworn documents that omit your own accounts. The line became completely silent. When Layla spoke again, her tone had changed. What accounts? Brian understood the strategy, a question instead of a denial. Your attorney will explain the disclosure request. Are you threatening me? No? Then what are you doing? Answering the petition you filed? She lowered her voice. Brian, we should talk privately. We are talking. Not over the phone. Victoria had instructed him to avoid private in-person discussions once litigation began. Speak through the attorneys. Layla sounded almost desperate. We don't need to destroy each other. Brian thought about the altered receipts, the secret transfers, the messages recovered from her company laptop. The distribution schedule marked LH. I haven't tried to destroy anyone. You hid an entire company. I disclosed it under oath. He paused. Now you will do the same. Layla ended the call without saying goodbye. Brian placed the phone beside the payroll report. 10 minutes later, Emily knocked. Everything all right? Yes. She glanced at the phone, then toward him. She knows. Brian nodded. Emily understood without asking another question. That evening, Layla did not return home. At 11:08 p.m., she sent a short message. Staying with a friend. I need space. Brian did not reply. The next morning, Victoria received Layla's preliminary financial disclosures. The L. Harper account appeared. So did the $125,000 transfer. But Layla identified the money as consulting income earned through independent marketing work. No contracts supported the claim. No invoices described services. No tax filings reported the earlier payments. Michael Grant reviewed the disclosure twice. Then he found a new problem. Layla had listed Midwest Strategic Advisors as a client. Corporate records showed she was not merely its consultant. She owned 40% of the company. Victoria placed the ownership filing beside Layla's sworn disclosure. The signature at the bottom matched the approval signatures on Daniel's altered expense reports. Brian stared at the page. Layla had asked the court to uncover whatever he was hiding. Instead, discovery had revealed what she had hidden first. Victoria did not accuse Layla of lying in her financial disclosure. Not immediately. Instead, she sent a formal request for clarification. The letter contained 9 questions. What services had Layla provided to Midwest Strategic Advisors? When had she acquired her ownership interest? What consideration had she paid for 40% of the company? Why had Mercer Logistics transferred money to a company partly owned by one of its own department directors? Where were the consulting contracts? Where were the invoices? Where were the tax records? Who authorized the $125,000 transfer? Why had it occurred 43 minutes after the divorce petition was filed? The final question was the simplest. Identify every person who held any direct or indirect financial interest in Midwest Strategic Advisors. Charles Whitman requested 10 additional days to answer. Victoria gave him 3. Why not deny the extension completely? Brian asked. They were sitting inside her conference room on Wednesday morning. Because reasonable lawyers look stronger in court. Victoria signed the response. 3 days is enough to review records that should already exist. And if they don't exist, then 10 days would not create them. Michael Grant sat beside them with a spreadsheet open on his laptop. He had traced nearly 2 years of payments involving Midwest Strategic Advisors. The pattern was no longer difficult to see. Mercer Logistics paid several transportation vendors. Some vendors forwarded portions of those payments to Midwest. Midwest distributed money to Daniel's accounts, Layla's account, and 2 unidentified entities. Not every transaction was suspicious. Some vendors appeared legitimate. Some invoices reflected real work. But others contained duplicated shipment numbers, inconsistent dates, and routes that Mercer Logistics' own operational records showed had never occurred. Michael turned the laptop toward Brian. At minimum, someone used legitimate vendors to conceal false charges. Brian studied the transactions. How much? So far, Michael adjusted the date range. Just under $2.4 million. Brian looked at Victoria. Does Mercer Logistics know the total? They have their own forensic team. Victoria folded her hands. They may have found more. Brian felt the scale of the matter shift again. The private dinners had cost several $1,000s. The broader pattern involved millions. A marriage had broken open a corporate system. Or perhaps the system had been there first, quietly shaping the marriage around it. Brian could not know. He only knew the timeline now reached back 18 months. The affair might have begun before the company. The company might have begun before the affair. Evidence had not yet established which came first. At 11:20 a.m., Angela Foster called. Daniel Mercer had retained criminal defense counsel. He would no longer participate voluntarily in Mercer Logistics' internal investigation. Has he been charged? Brian asked. No, Angela said, but federal investigators have requested documents. Victoria leaned closer to the speakerphone. Which agency? Angela answered carefully. I am not authorized to discuss that. Brian understood. The investigation had moved beyond company discipline. What about Layla? He asked. Angela paused. She was placed on administrative leave this morning. Brian looked toward the closed conference room door. Has she been told why? She received a standard notice concerning preservation of company records and potential policy violations. Nothing criminal. Nothing from Mercer Logistics. Angela's distinction was deliberate. She could speak only for the company, not for outside investigators. The call ended. Brian returned to Hawthorne House shortly after noon. He expected questions from employees. None came. Emily had instructed senior staff not to discuss rumors involving guests, corporate clients, or Brian's divorce. The rule protected everyone. Brian spent the afternoon reviewing ordinary work: a broken refrigeration seal, a dispute over linen invoices, a proposed change to the private dining menu. At 4:15, Olivia entered the office. A woman is asking for you. Who? Layla. Brian looked at Olivia. Where is she? Near the host stand. Did she ask for the owner? Olivia hesitated. She asked for her husband. Brian stood. Layla waited beneath the chandelier near the restaurant entrance. She wore a navy coat and carried no handbag. Her face looked pale. Several staff members recognized her from the river room, but no one stared. Brian approached calmly. This isn't a good place to talk. I know. Her eyes moved across the dining room. For the first time, she seemed to see Hawthorne House differently. Not as a restaurant where Brian worked, as a place he owned. Every polished table, every employee, every reserved room, every detail she had dismissed as belonging to someone else's success. We need 5 minutes, she said. Your attorney can contact Victoria. This isn't about the divorce. Brian held her gaze. Then what is it about? Layla lowered her voice. Daniel. Brian did not respond. He isn't answering me. That sounds like something between you and Daniel. Her jaw tightened. You know what's happening. I know several investigations exist. You started them. Brian's expression remained unchanged. No. You gave them the restaurant records. After lawful requests. You preserved everything. That is standard procedure. Layla glanced towards the employees nearby. Can we go somewhere private? Brian considered refusing. Then he remembered Victoria's advice. Do not meet alone. He gestured toward a small consultation room beside the host office. The door contained a glass panel. Emily remained within sight outside. Brian left the door partly open. Layla noticed. You don't trust me. This is a legal dispute. Her face tightened again. I didn't know about the altered receipts. Brian said nothing. I approved expense reports. I didn't create them. Tell that to the investigators. I did. She stepped closer to the table. The money from Midwest was consulting income. What consulting? Brand strategy. For transportation vendors. Layla looked away. Brian had his answer. Not proof, but an answer. She spoke more quietly. Daniel said the company needed a structure for outside projects. And he gave you 40%. I helped build it. By doing what? Her silence lasted too long. Brian remained calm. Layla finally said, I introduced him to people. Which people? I don't remember every conversation. Then your attorney should review the records. She looked at him with sudden anger. Stop talking to me like I'm one of your employees. I don't talk to my employees this way. The statement landed harder than he intended. Layla stepped back. For a moment, the anger left her face. Only exhaustion remained. I made mistakes. Brian waited. But I didn't steal millions of dollars. I haven't said you did. You think it. I think the records need explanations. She shook her head. You always do that. Do what? Hide behind calm words. Brian studied her. For years, Layla had interpreted control as emptiness. Now she interpreted precision as cruelty. I am choosing words that are true, he said. She looked through the glass panel toward the dining room. Did you know about us before that night? No. Did Olivia tell you? She recognized you after you arrived. Layla closed her eyes briefly. So you watched. I reviewed security footage after staff reported a potential conflict involving a guest connected to me. You watched me take off my ring. Brian felt the memory return, the small movement, the ring disappearing into her handbag. Yes. Layla pressed her lips together. I was going to tell you. When? After the filing. Brian almost laughed, but nothing about it felt amusing. You planned to tell me after a process server did. She looked down. Daniel said it would be cleaner. There it was. Not an excuse, a transfer of responsibility, Daniel said. Daniel planned. Daniel handled the reports. Daniel created the structure. Brian asked the question that mattered. Why are you here? Layla looked up. Because my attorney says your lawyers will accuse me of financial misconduct. My lawyers have asked for records. Those records can ruin me. If they are accurate, the records describe what happened. Her voice dropped. Withdraw the request about Midwest. No. Brian. No. Layla's eyes filled, but no tears fell. You don't understand what Daniel told me. Then explain it. She looked toward the open door. He said the money was being held until the divorce. Brian remained still. Held for what? For us. What does that mean? He said once I filed, we could separate my finances from yours. Brian thought of the transfer schedule. Next transfer after Thompson filing. Why did my filing matter to a logistics company? Layla's breathing changed. She understood the problem only after hearing it spoken aloud. I don't know. Did you ask? No. Did you sign documents? Some. Did you read them? Her silence returned. Brian felt something colder than anger. She had trusted Daniel with documents she had never read while accusing her husband of lacking ambition because he kept his achievements private. Layla stepped closer. Please don't give them anything else. I will comply with every lawful request. Even if it destroys me. Brian looked directly at her. I didn't create the records. The words left her motionless. Outside the room, Emily turned towards the entrance. Two men in dark suits had entered the restaurant. They showed identification to the host and asked for Layla Thompson. Layla saw them through the glass. Her face lost all color. Brian did not recognize the men. They approached without urgency. One remained near the doorway. The other spoke in a quiet, formal tone. Mrs. Thompson, we are federal investigators. We would like to ask you questions concerning Mercer Logistics and Midwest Strategic Advisors. Layla looked at Brian. For 1 second, he saw the question in her eyes. Would he save her? Would he speak for her? Would he make this disappear? Brian answered only with the truth. You need to call your attorney. The investigator nodded. That would be appropriate. Layla reached for her phone with an unsteady hand. As she stepped away, Brian remained beside the open consultation room door. He felt no victory, only the final collapse of an illusion. Layla had believed the quiet man beside her possessed no power. Now she understood the opposite. Brian had enough power to destroy her with one decision, and enough discipline not to use it. He would not punish her. He would not protect her from the truth, either. The federal investigators did not question Layla inside Hawthorne House. After she contacted Charles Whitman, the interview was postponed until her attorney could attend. She left through the main entrance 15 minutes later. The investigators followed at a distance. Brian watched from the consultation room. Layla did not look back. By 6 o'clock, dinner service had filled every table. The restaurant continued as though nothing had happened. Brian preferred it that way. Hawthorne House had survived recessions, ownership disputes, construction failures, and years when a single bad week threatened payroll. It would not become a stage for his divorce. At 8:40 p.m., Victoria arrived. Emily led her upstairs. Brian was reviewing vendor renewals when Victoria entered the operations office and closed the door. Layla's attorney called. Brian set down his pen. What did he want? A temporary agreement. About the divorce. About everything. Victoria placed a letter on the desk. Charles Whitman proposed freezing the L. Harper account, suspending further discovery into Midwest Strategic Advisors, and beginning immediate settlement negotiations. In exchange, Layla would withdraw her request for temporary maintenance and abandon her claim to Brian's non-marital ownership interest in Hawthorne House. Brian read the letter once. Can she claim my non-marital interest anyway? She can challenge the tracing, but our records are strong. Very. He returned the letter. So she is offering to give up a weak claim if we stop examining her strongest problem. Victoria nodded. That's how I read it. What did you tell him? That I would speak with you. Brian looked through the glass wall toward the dining room below. Do we need the Midwest records to divide our marital property? Yes. Then we continue. Victoria studied him. Even if the criminal investigation becomes worse for her, Brian turned back. I am not asking for criminal charges. No. But discovery may produce evidence investigators can obtain later. I understand. Victoria leaned against the desk. There is another option. Brian waited. We can seek a protective order. Meaning? The divorce court can restrict sensitive financial records from public disclosure. Would it stop federal investigators? No. Would it hide evidence? No. It would only prevent unnecessary public distribution. Brian nodded. Request it. Victoria's expression softened slightly. You still want to protect her privacy. I want to protect the integrity of the case. She recognized the distinction, but perhaps not entirely. Brian did not want Layla humiliated in newspapers. He did not want strangers studying their marriage for entertainment. He wanted facts placed before the proper people. Nothing more. The next morning, Mercer Logistics issued a public statement. Daniel Mercer had been terminated for violations of company expense conflict of interest and record preservation policies. The statement did not mention fraud. It did not mention Layla. It did not mention Hawthorne House. Still, reporters began asking questions. By noon, 2 journalists had called the restaurant. Emily rejected both requests. At 1:15, a camera crew appeared across the street. Brian watched them through an upstairs window. They'll connect the restaurant eventually, Emily said. Maybe. What should staff say? Nothing. Not even that Daniel was a guest. Guest information remains confidential. Emily nodded. And you? I'm not giving interviews. That answer became more difficult by late afternoon. A business reporter published an article identifying Hawthorne House as one of the locations connected to Daniel's disputed expense reports. The article cited anonymous corporate sources. Within an hour, Brian's hidden ownership also became public. Majority owner revealed during high-asset divorce. The headline appeared on several local websites. Photographs showed Brian leaving Victoria's building. Another showed his old Highlander parked behind Hawthorne House. Commentators treated the contrast as a mystery. Why would a man worth millions drive an aging vehicle? Why had his wife believed he was only a consultant? Was the restaurant part of a hidden fortune? Brian read none of the articles beyond their headlines. At 4:30, Harold Whitmore called. You've become interesting. Brian looked at the reporters gathering outside. I preferred being boring. Harold laughed. Most sensible people do. Will this hurt the restaurant? Temporarily, it may increase reservations. That isn't what I meant. I know. Harold's tone became serious. People trust institutions that behave consistently under pressure. Brian understood. No statements beyond facts. No attacks. No performances. Exactly. That evening, Layla returned to the Lincoln Park house. Brian arrived after 10 and found her sitting at the dining table. No candles. No music. A stack of printed articles lay in front of her. Cooper rested near her chair. Layla looked exhausted. You made the news. So did Daniel. She pushed one article toward him. They know you owned the restaurant. It was disclosed in court. My lawyer says the filing should have been private. The valuation became part of a motion your attorney filed. Layla looked down. Charles had apparently not explained that detail. People are calling me a gold digger. Brian did not touch the article. I haven't spoken to the press. I know. Victoria is requesting a protective order. Layla looked up. For me? For both of us. Her expression changed. For a moment, the distance between them seemed smaller. Then her phone vibrated. She turned it face down without reading the screen. Brian noticed. He said nothing. Layla folded her hands. The investigators asked about Midwest. What did your attorney advise? To answer only what I knew. That seems reasonable. They showed me invoices. Brian waited. Some had my electronic approval. Did you approve them? I approved payment summaries. Not the invoices. I don't remember seeing every page. Brian sat across from her. Layla, I cannot help you reconstruct what happened. I know. Her voice cracked slightly. Daniel can. Brian held her gaze. If he chooses to. He won't answer me. That no longer surprised him. Daniel had retained criminal counsel. Every communication now carried risk. Layla looked toward the dark window. He told me Midwest was legal. That doesn't mean every transaction was. He said the vendor payments were rebates. For what? Volume commitments. Did Mercer Logistics know? Layla did not answer. Brian felt the familiar coldness return, not because she stayed silent, because the question should have been asked 18 months earlier. She reached for one of the printed articles. They say Hawthorne House could be worth more than $30 million. Valuations change. You really don't care, do you? About the number? About what people think? Brian considered it. I care what people affected by my decisions think. Employees. Partners. Guests. Not strangers. Layla gave a small, bitter laugh. I spent years trying to impress strangers. Brian did not disagree. She looked at him. Did you ever plan to tell me? About the restaurant? Yes. I planned to tell you when privacy stopped protecting it. Protecting it from me. Protecting our life from money. Layla's eyes hardened. Well, you don't get to make that decision alone. No. Brian accepted the criticism. I should have told you. She seemed unprepared for the admission. He continued, but my silence did not create your decisions. The softness left her face. Your lawyer says I hid money. The records say you did not disclose it. I was going to amend the filing. After we identified the account. Layla stood and walked toward the kitchen. Brian remained seated. At the doorway, she stopped. I need to ask you something. He waited. If the government offers me a deal, Brian's attention sharpened. And they want information about Daniel, what should I do? Ask your criminal attorney. I'm asking my husband. The word sounded misplaced now. Brian answered carefully. Tell the truth. What if the truth destroys him? Brian thought of Daniel in the river room, confident, relaxed, certain that Brian would never see anything coming. The truth does not belong to him. Layla looked away, her shoulders lowered. Then she said something Brian had not expected. There is another account. The house became silent. What account? I don't control it. Who does? Daniel. Why does it matter? Layla turned toward him. Because Midwest wasn't holding $2 million. Brian waited. Her next words changed the scale of everything again. It was holding 12. Brian did not ask Layla another question. Not in the dining room, not without attorneys, not after she had disclosed the existence of an account containing $12 million. He remained seated while she stood near the kitchen doorway, both of them listening to Cooper breathe softly beneath the table. Finally, Brian spoke. You need to tell your attorney tonight. Layla looked at him. I told you first. That was a mistake. Her expression hardened. I thought you would help me. I am helping you. By sending me back to lawyers. By stopping this conversation before either of us makes the situation worse. Layla walked back to the table. I don't know the account number. Then say that. I don't know which bank holds it. Say that too. I only saw it once. Brian kept his voice calm. Explain exactly what you saw. She sat across from him. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she looked toward the printed articles scattered across the table. It was on Daniel's laptop. When? About 6 months ago. Where? At his apartment. Brian felt the words, but he did not react. That detail belonged to the marriage. The account belonged to something larger. He refused to mix them. What did you see? A spreadsheet. With $12 million. Almost 12. Whose money? Layla rubbed her hands together. I don't know. Brian waited. She finally continued. The file listed payments from several vendors. Some names were familiar, others weren't. Was Midwest listed? Yes. What else? 3 holding companies. Names. I only remember one. Brian remained silent. Northbridge Capital Partners. Did Daniel own it? He said it belonged to investors. Which investors? He didn't say. Brian looked at the clock. It was nearly 11. Call Charles. Layla reached for her phone, then stopped. What if he tells the federal investigators? He may be required to. Fear crossed her face. Brian recognized it clearly now. Until that moment, Layla had treated the investigation as a problem that might be negotiated. An employment dispute, a divorce complication, a series of documents that could be explained with better language. $12 million had changed that. Daniel said the money was protected, she whispered. Protected from whom? The company. Brian studied her. Why would legitimate money need protection from Mercer Logistics? Layla looked away. The silence answered for her. She called Charles Whitman from the dining room. Brian stood and walked into the kitchen, giving her privacy, while remaining close enough to ensure she did not leave in panic. He poured a glass of water. His hands remained steady. Inside, his thoughts moved quickly. $12 million could represent many things. Gross payments, projected revenue, combined vendor balances, money already distributed, money that had never existed. Layla had seen a spreadsheet, not a verified bank statement. Brian reminded himself of Michael's rule. A number inside a document was not proof of money. It was proof only that someone had written a number. 20 minutes later, Layla entered the kitchen. "Charles is contacting a criminal attorney." "Good. He told me not to speak to anyone else?" Brian nodded. "Listen to him." "That includes you?" "Yes." Layla seemed disappointed by his agreement. Perhaps she had expected him to resist the distance. He did not. Their marriage had already become a field of competing legal duties. Affection could no longer replace procedure. The next morning, Brian met Victoria and Michael before business hours at Hawthorne House. The main dining room was empty. Sunlight crossed the polished floor, while the cleaning staff worked quietly near the bar. Victoria listened as Brian repeated Layla's statements. He used exact language. He did not interpret her fear. He did not add conclusions. When he finished, Victoria closed her notebook. "You handled it correctly." "Can we investigate Northbridge?" Michael answered. "Public records first." He searched the name through several business databases. Dozens of similar companies appeared. 3 used the exact title. One was registered in Delaware, one in Nevada, one in Illinois. The Illinois company had been created 20 months earlier. Its registered address belonged to a commercial mail service. The manager listed on its formation document was not Daniel Mercer. It was Robert Hale. Brian recognized the surname from none of the existing records. Michael searched further. Robert Hale had worked as Senior Vice President of Procurement at Mercer Logistics until retiring the previous year. Victoria leaned toward the screen. One of the unidentified initials on the distribution schedule was RH. Brian remembered the paper recovered from Hawthorne House's safe. 40% to DM, 20% to LH, 3 other sets of initials. RH could mean Robert Hale, or anyone else. "We still need authentication," Brian said. Michael nodded. "But now we have a direction." By noon, Angela Foster confirmed that Mercer Logistics had used Northbridge Capital Partners as a consulting vendor. The company had received more than $9 million over 18 months. Its contracts concerned supply chain optimization and international vendor strategy. Angela's internal team had found no employees' offices or completed work product. "Who approved the contracts?" Victoria asked. Angela answered after a pause. "Daniel Mercer." "And procurement?" "Robert Hale." Brian looked at Michael. The pattern tightened. Not enough for a conclusion. Enough for another lawful inquiry. Angela continued. "Federal investigators served additional subpoenas this morning. For Northbridge. I can't confirm the targets." Her refusal confirmed nothing. Still, the timing mattered. Before ending the call, Angela added one more fact. Mercer Logistics had reviewed access records from Daniel's company laptop. The spreadsheet Layla described had been opened several times. The file name was Reserve Allocation. Its last recorded value was $11,840,000. Brian felt no surprise, only a deepening sense of scale. Layla had remembered accurately. After the call, Michael began mapping known payments. $9 million to Northbridge, more than $2 million through Midwest, additional transfers through transportation vendors. The numbers approached the value on the spreadsheet. Victoria stood near the conference room window. If the government links these entities, Daniel's expense reports will become the smallest part of the case. Brian gathered the documents. And the divorce. It continues. Can Layla's possible criminal exposure delay it? Possibly. Her attorneys may ask the court to pause financial discovery if answering could affect her constitutional rights. Brian understood. The same disclosures she had demanded from him could now force her to choose between revealing financial information and protecting herself in another investigation. What happens to the marital assets? We seek an immediate preservation order. That afternoon, Victoria filed an emergency motion preventing either spouse from transferring, concealing, borrowing against, or destroying property outside ordinary living expenses. The judge granted temporary restrictions pending a hearing. The order applied equally to Brian and Layla. Brian welcomed it. His records were complete. His assets were stable. He had nothing to move. At 4:50 p.m., Charles Whitman delivered notice that Layla had retained a criminal defense attorney and would invoke her right against self-incrimination regarding certain questions about Midwest strategic advisors. Victoria read the notice without visible reaction. Then she handed Brian another document. Layla had also amended her divorce petition. She withdrew her request for temporary maintenance. She no longer sought Brian's business interests. She requested only half the marital portion of their home savings and retirement accounts. Brian read the amendment. The aggressive language was gone. No accusations about his hidden assets. No demand to investigate Hawthorne House. No claim that he had denied her security. "She wants out quickly," he said. Victoria nodded. "Do you?" Brian thought of the woman he had married. The woman who once sat beside him in a nearly empty restaurant and said she believed he would rebuild it. That memory was real. So was everything that followed. "I want it resolved fairly." "That may not be quickly." "I know." His phone rang. Emily was calling from downstairs. 2 federal investigators had returned to Hawthorne House. This time they carried a warrant for records connected to Northbridge Capital Partners. Brian and Victoria joined them in the operations office. The investigators requested reservation histories, payment records, and private room service logs. Emily searched the company name. One result appeared. A dinner held 11 months earlier. River Room. 6 guests. The reservation was not under Daniel Mercer. It was under Robert Hale. The payment had been made by Northbridge Capital Partners. Emily opened the guest notes. 5 names appeared only as initials. DM LHRH, 2 others. At the bottom was a special instruction. Prepare ownership documents for signature. Brian stared at the date. It was the same week Midwest Strategic Advisors had been formed. The investigator requested the archived security footage. Emily checked the retention system. Ordinary footage had already expired. But the dinner had been flagged after a billing dispute. A preserved clip remained. No audio, only images. The video began. Robert Hale entered first. Daniel followed. Then Layla appeared carrying a thick legal folder. She sat between them. Near the end of the recording, the 6 guests signed several documents. Layla signed last. The camera captured the cover page when she turned the folder. Midwest Strategic Advisors Operating Agreement. Brian watched his wife place her signature beneath the others. She had not merely received shares later. She had been present when the company was created, and 11 months before she filed for divorce, she had already joined the financial structure that would eventually help destroy everything she believed she was building. The preserved video did not prove that Layla understood every page she signed. It proved only that she had been present, that she had signed the operating agreement, that she had accepted ownership from the beginning. Victoria repeated those limits before anyone discussed the footage further. "No assumptions," she said. Brian stood beside her in Hawthorne House's operations office, while the federal investigators copied the archived file. The lead investigator, Agent Collins, signed the evidence receipt and placed it inside a sealed folder. "We may need testimony from the employee who preserved this recording." Emily remained near the terminal. "I preserved it after the billing dispute." "Do you remember the dispute?" "Yes." She opened the original incident note. Northbridge had challenged a service charge for secure document handling. The charge had been removed because the restaurant no longer offered that service. The disputed invoice caused the system to flag and preserve the related video. Brian looked at the note. Again, an ordinary business procedure had kept something no one expected to need. Agent Collins asked Emily several more questions. Her answers stayed narrow. She had not attended the dinner. She had not heard any conversation. She could authenticate the reservation system and the preserved video. Nothing more. The investigators left shortly before noon. Victoria remained. Layla's criminal attorney will receive notice that this footage exists. Brian looked toward the empty hallway. When? Possibly today. Will she be arrested? I don't know. Victoria closed her briefcase. Signing an agreement is not automatically a crime. Brian nodded, but investigators will ask why she denied knowing how Midwest was formed. She said Daniel handled the structure. That statement can still be partly true. Brian appreciated the restraint. Even now, Victoria refused to turn suspicion into certainty. At 2:30 p.m., Layla's attorney requested an immediate settlement conference in the divorce case. Victoria accepted. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning at her office. Brian arrived early. The conference room had been arranged with two sides facing each other. Victoria and Brian sat near the windows. Michael Grant joined them with financial summaries. Across the table sat Charles Whitman, Layla's criminal attorney, and Layla herself. She looked thinner than she had 2 weeks earlier. No jewelry, no wedding ring, no carefully chosen expression. Only exhaustion. Charles opened the meeting. Our goal is to resolve the marital case without interfering with the federal investigation. Victoria nodded. That is also our goal. Charles placed a proposed settlement on the table. Layla would waive any claim to Brian's non-marital ownership in Hawthorne House. She would also waive maintenance and attorney fees. Brian would retain his retirement accounts and business interests. Layla would receive half the marital equity in the Lincoln Park home and half the verified joint savings. The L. Harper account and any interest in Midwest Strategic Advisors would be assigned entirely to Layla, subject to investigation forfeiture or third-party claims. Brian read the proposal. What happens to the $125,000 transferred after the filing? Charles answered carefully. It remains frozen. Is Layla claiming it? No final position. Michael looked toward the criminal attorney. That money may belong to Mercer Logistics. The attorney did not disagree. Victoria reviewed the remaining pages. There was no demand that Brian pay Layla for any portion of Hawthorne House. No challenge to the valuation. No attempt to classify all of his ownership as marital property. On paper, the offer was far better for Brian than the original petition. That did not make it complete. Victoria turned to Layla. Your sworn disclosure identified Midwest payments as consulting income. Layla looked toward her criminal attorney. He answered for her. Mrs. Thompson will amend that description. To what? Disputed distributions from a company in which she holds an ownership interest. Victoria's expression remained still. Did she perform consulting work? The attorney raised a hand. She will not answer questions that overlap with the investigation. Victoria accepted the refusal. This divorce cannot be settled with false disclosures remaining in the record. Charles nodded. Corrected disclosures will be filed. For nearly 2 hours, the lawyers reviewed assets, line by line. The home, savings, retirement accounts, Brian's premarital investment proceeds, the employee trust, the Whitmore Foundation shares, Hawthorne House distributions reinvested during the marriage. Some business growth would require valuation and tracing. Brian did not argue against Layla receiving whatever portion the law considered marital. He wanted accuracy, not punishment. Near the end, Charles requested a private break. Layla remained at the table while the attorneys stepped into the hallway. Brian began gathering his papers. "Did you know?" Layla asked. He looked up. "Know what?" "That the video existed." "Not until Emily found it." Layla lowered her eyes. "I barely remember that dinner." Brian said nothing. "Daniel told me the company was for marketing projects. You signed the agreement." "I know." "Did you read it?" "Some of it." Her voice was quiet. "He said the ownership protected my work." "What work?" Layla looked toward the closed door. "Introductions. Approvals." Her eyes returned to him. "Sometimes." Brian waited. She shook her head. "I can't discuss this." "Then don't." She seemed almost frustrated by his refusal to push. "I thought you would be angry." "I am." "You never show it." "Showing it would not change the facts." Layla stared at the table. "Daniel said your silence meant you had nothing to fight for." Brian felt the sentence settle slowly. "What did you say?" "I agreed with him." She looked at him now. "I was wrong." Brian did not offer comfort. He also did not use the admission against her. The attorneys returned. Victoria placed a revised term sheet in front of Brian. The agreement would not finalize ownership of disputed money connected to Midwest or Northbridge. Those funds would remain frozen until lawful ownership was determined. The rest of the marital estate could be divided separately. Brian reviewed the changes. Then he pointed to one paragraph. "The house." Charles looked toward him. "What about it?" "Layla can keep it." Victoria turned sharply. Brian continued. "She refinances within 6 months and pays me half the verified marital equity." Charles nodded slowly. "That is acceptable." Layla looked surprised. Brian had no desire to remain in the house. Every room now carried 2 versions of the same memory. What he believed had happened. What had actually happened. Victoria added enforcement terms in case refinancing failed. The lawyers agreed. At 12:47 p.m., both sides signed the temporary settlement framework. Not the final divorce judgment, not a criminal resolution, only a structure allowing the marriage to end without deciding ownership of potentially stolen funds. After the meeting, Layla waited near the elevator. Brian stood several feet away. When the doors opened, she did not enter. "Do you hate me?" she asked. Brian looked at her. The truthful answer was more complicated than yes or no. "I hate what happened." "That's not what I asked." "No." Layla's eyes filled. "Why not?" "Because hatred would keep me attached to you." The elevator doors began closing. Brian pressed the button and held them open. Layla stepped inside. Before the doors shut, she looked at him once more. "I did love you." Brian believed that she probably had. Once, perhaps even for years. But love had not prevented secrecy. It had not prevented contempt. It had not prevented her from building a future with another man while treating Brian's quiet life as proof of failure. "I know," he said. The doors closed. That afternoon, Brian returned to Hawthorne House. Marcus was arguing with a produce supplier. Olivia was rearranging a private room schedule. Emily stood near the host desk reviewing reservations. The restaurant remained alive. Brian walked through the dining room without stopping. A young server approached him nervously. "Mr. Thompson." "Yes." "Table 12 says the soup is too salty." Brian looked toward the kitchen. "Replace it." "Should we remove it from the bill?" "Of course." The server hurried away. Brian continued towards the operations office. Millions of dollars were under investigation. His marriage was ending. Reporters waited outside. Yet one guest had received a bad bowl of soup. That problem could be solved immediately. Brian opened the kitchen door and found Marcus already preparing the replacement. Their eyes met. "No speech?" Marcus asked. "About the soup." "About everything." Brian looked around the kitchen. Cooks moved between stations. Pans struck burners. Tickets lined the rail. No speech. Marcus nodded. Good. Brian stood beside him as the corrected dish left the pass. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. Not because the danger had passed. It had not. Not because the truth was complete. It was still unfolding. But the marriage no longer controlled every breath. The investigation no longer defined every room. Brian still owned the work he had built. He still had people who respected him without needing headlines or valuations. And somewhere inside the federal case, Daniel Mercer was learning the same lesson Layla had learned too late. A quiet man was not an empty man. Silence was not surrender. And patience, when supported by records, discipline, and truth, could become the most powerful answer in the room. The deepest lesson in Brian's story is that true strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it is the courage to remain honest when betrayal gives you every reason to become cruel. Brian lost the marriage he believed in, but he did not lose himself. He chose facts over revenge, dignity over humiliation, and discipline over anger. In doing so, he proved that character is not revealed when life is easy. It is revealed when everything familiar begins to fall apart. This story also reminds us not to measure people by what they display. A quiet life is not an empty life. Modesty is not failure. Kindness is not weakness. Many of the strongest people are building their future without applause, protecting their peace without explanation, and carrying responsibilities that others never see. Most importantly, betrayal may change your path, but it does not have to destroy your purpose. You can walk away from broken trust without becoming broken yourself. You can let the truth speak without using it as a weapon. And you can begin again not as the person you were before the pain, but as someone wiser, clearer, and stronger. What lesson from Brian's journey touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional stories about betrayal, truth, resilience, and quiet strength, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.